Hi everyone, if you enjoyed this video please subscribe. If you haven't subscribed yet, I'd love to see you join me. And don't forget to like and let me know what you think in the comments. My name is Mark Riley. I'm 42 years old, and what I'm about to share happened last autumn in the dense woods near a tiny place called Noun, Indiana. I'd planned a family camping trip there. Just me, my wife, Sarah, and our two kids, Lily 14 and Jake 9. I was hoping we'd find a way to reconnect, away from all the distractions at home. I was convinced that if we cut ourselves off from our phones and the internet, we'd finally start talking to each other again. I had no idea how horribly wrong things would go. The drive out was tense from the start. Lily rolled her eyes at everything I said. Jake, cheerful enough, pressed his nose against the car window and asked endless questions about the forest. Sarah, at 38, tried to keep the peace, giving Lily reassuring smiles and telling Jake to calm down, but I could sense her growing worries. The sky was getting overcast, and we were still miles from any real road. When we turned onto the gravel lane leading into the woods, the trees loomed over us, their bare autumn branches clattering in the breeze, and leaves whirled across the windshield. I tried to ignore the hollow feeling in my stomach. I'd insisted on picking a spot far from any official campground, wanting a true off-grid experience. We parked in a tiny clearing off the side of the lane, loaded ourselves with gear, and hiked deeper until we found a level patch of ground near a thin creek. That was when I discovered the first problem: the tent. The zipper was half broken. No matter how carefully I tugged at it, it wouldn't seal properly. I cursed under my breath, trying to fix it while Sarah and Lily exchanged glances. Finally, I gave up and rigged a makeshift solution with some rope. It wasn't perfect, but at least it kept the tent from flapping open completely. The stove didn't fare much better. I tested it before we left, but out here in the cold and damp, the tiny propane burner sputtered and died. We resorted to a smoky campfire that never seemed to stay lit. Lily snidely asked why we hadn't just booked a hotel if we weren't prepared, which sparked an argument. By the end of our first night, tensions were high. I remember thinking that we just needed time to adjust and that it would all get better in the morning. It didn't. Early the next day, we decided to go for a hike. I'd read about a scenic viewpoint somewhere nearby, and I figured it would be a good way to lift everyone's spirits. The forest was eerily quiet, except for the crunch of leaves under our boots. We hadn't been walking long when we stumbled upon it, deer, standing right in the middle of the trail, maybe 10 feet away, just watching us. At first, I thought it was just curious, but then I noticed its head. It was tilted at this really bizarre angle, almost like its neck was broken or something. And its eyes, they seemed way too wide, too focused on us. Jake, who's fearless to a fault, took a step toward it, probably thinking it was hurt. I pulled him back fast. That deer never blinked, never even flinched. It just stared, that crooked head turning in a way that sent shivers down my spine. We gave it a wide berth, circling around it slowly, keeping our eyes on it the whole time. When we were safely past, I glanced back over my shoulder. The deer's gaze was still locked on us, unchanging. Lily whispered that it was creepy, and I saw Sarah hug herself, shivering even though it wasn't that cold. I told everyone it was probably just sick, but a chill crawled up my spine. I'd grown up in the city, but something about that animal felt wrong, just plain wrong. That night, as we huddled around our pathetic, smoky campfire, we heard it, the first voice. It was faint at first, just a single, drawn-out wail. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, or maybe some animal. But then it came again, clearer this time. It sounded unmistakably like Jake. "Help," it cried. Then, damn, but Jake was sitting right next to me, poking at the flames with a stick. He froze. We all stared out into the darkness, our hearts pounding. Sarah's eyes met mine, wide with a silent question, "What do we do?" Lily looked terrified, and for once, Jake was speechless. I stood up, grabbed the flashlight, and took a few steps toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, making the branches sway back and forth, casting these skeletal shadows on the ground. I aimed the light deeper into the woods, but I couldn't see anything. And then that voice called out again, with this eerie echo. "Help me." "Mom, Dad." This time it was quieter, as if it were moving away. We decided to stay put, hoping that whatever it was wouldn't come back. We didn't sleep well after that. The tent's broken zipper let in the cold air, and every breeze that rustled the tent fabric was enough to jolt me awake. By morning, we were all exhausted, and that's when we realized our backpack was gone. The one with the map, half our food, and the flashlight. Sarah asked if I'd left it somewhere. Lily insisted she hadn't touched it. I was sure I'd set it right next to the tent. We searched the campsite, the surrounding woods, everywhere. But it was just gone, vanished. Like whatever was out there had taken it. As if the missing supplies weren't bad enough, the weather decided to turn on us. A biting wind picked up, and the temperature plummeted. We seriously considered packing up and trying to hike out, but I was stubborn. I didn't want to admit defeat. I convinced everyone that we should hike back to where I suspected that Scenic Viewpoint was. Maybe we'd find a ranger or another camper who could help. Lily complained the entire way, and Sarah's face was drawn with worry. Jake, usually so full of energy, was strangely subdued. He kept bounding ahead, and I kept yelling at him to slow down. We never found that viewpoint. Instead, we got hopelessly lost. Every path we took seemed to loop back to the same clearing, like the forest was shifting around us, deliberately confusing us. By the time we finally stumbled back to our campsite, dusk was starting to settle in, and we were all on edge. It was Lily who snapped first. She flung down her backpack and started shouting at me, accusing me of dragging everyone out here to freeze and starve. I shouted back, my own frustration rising. I felt like I was failing them. Sarah tried to calm us down, but before she could, Lily turned and stormed off into the trees. Normally, I'd give her some space to cool off, but something about this place felt so wrong that I went after her. Sarah and Jake stayed behind in case she circled back. I tramped through the underbrush, calling her name until my throat hurt. By the time I found her, she was standing in a small clearing, her eyes wide and vacant, her arms limp at her sides. She didn't respond when I said her name, didn't move when I gently shook her shoulder. It was like she was in a trance. Finally, she blinked and whispered, "It's not safe here," and then she just collapsed into my arms. I carried her back to camp, where Sarah helped me lay her down inside the tent. Lily came around slowly, claiming she couldn't remember anything after our argument. She kept asking if she was sick, and Sarah, bless her heart, tried to reassure her. We managed to get some warm broth into Lily, made from our dwindling supplies. There was so little left. The stove was still useless, so once again we relied on a weak, sputtering fire. That night, something scratched at the tent. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering, searching for a weapon. The best I could find was my camping knife. Sarah was trembling beside me. Lily was half asleep, but Jake was frighteningly silent. The scraping came again, slow, deliberate. Then, I heard my own voice from outside. "Sarah," it whispered, but I was inside the tent with her. My stomach twisted into a knot. Suddenly, the nylon ripped. A hand, or maybe a claw, shoved through, followed by a face. It wore Sarah's features, but it was wrong, stretched somehow, the eyes too big, the mouth twisted into a shapeless grin. I slashed wildly with my knife, and it shrank back, letting out a guttural hiss. In the darkness, I heard it scuttling away on all fours, followed by a burst of ragged breathing. Then, complete silence. We stayed awake the rest of the night, every nerve on edge, but it didn't return, whatever it was. The next day Sarah was quiet. Her eyes had deep shadows under them, and she barely spoke over our meager breakfast. I chalked it up to trauma. None of us had ever experienced terror like that. Lily was on edge too, but she clung to Sarah for comfort. Jake for once didn't race off. He stood by the fire, stirring the embers and looking utterly lost. That afternoon Sarah said she was going to check the creek for clean water. She didn't invite anyone to come along, which was odd, but we let her go. We regretted it almost immediately. We heard her screaming. Lily and I sprinted toward the sound, stumbling over logs and branches, our hearts pounding in our chests. We found Sarah by the water, on her knees, staring intently into the rushing creek. She was gasping for breath, but when I asked her what had happened, she just shook her head like she couldn't remember. Back at camp, she hardly ate. She claimed she was fine, just tired. But that night, I woke to find her standing over Lily, a fist-sized rock raised in her hand. I shouted her name, and she turned to me, her eyes wide and confused. She dropped the rock and started to cry, saying she had no memory of picking it up. My gut told me something was horribly wrong. I wondered if we should try to leave that very moment, but without a map or supplies. Wandering through the forest at night felt like suicide. Before I could decide, Jake disappeared. It happened the following afternoon. We'd all split up to look for firewood around the campsite. I told him to gather sticks from a nearby thicket and made him promise to stay within shouting distance. 10 minutes later, Sarah yelled that she couldn't find him. We called his name until our voices cracked, but we heard nothing. Eventually, we stumbled upon one of his shoes near the edge of the clearing. It was soaked in blood. I felt my heart constrict in my chest. Lily started to cry, and Sarah just stood there, staring at the shoe, her face pale. Then we heard Jake's voice again, distant and wavering, calling for help. We sprinted toward it, guided by desperation and terror. The voice led us deeper into the woods than we'd ever gone. Night fell, and we still pushed on, shining our remaining, dying flashlight around in circles. It died abruptly, leaving us in darkness. Sarah grabbed my arm and said we needed to rest, but I refused. My son was out there, maybe injured. Then the voice came again. "Dad, help me." We followed the sound until it led us to the entrance of a shallow cave, hidden behind a curtain of vines. Inside, the air was damp and full, stinking of rot. I swept the beam of a small backup flashlight across the stone walls, which were etched with strange symbols. Bones, some clearly animal, others suspiciously human, were scattered across the ground. My stomach turned. I couldn't imagine who or what had done this. But my mind flashed back to that thing that had ripped the tent. The flashlight flickered, casting frantic shadows. Then, from the darkness, we heard Jake's voice again. "Dad. Mom. Please." The words seemed to echo unnaturally. Sarah suddenly shoved me aside. It was so unlike her that I almost didn't react. She darted ahead, deeper into the cave, her movements jerky, almost puppet-like. Lily and I chased after her, terrified we'd lose her, too. The tunnels sloped downward until we reached a wide chamber, lit by faint moonlight filtering through cracks in the ceiling. There, among piles of bones, stood a tall, gaunt shape. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow. In its arms, it cradled something small, a bundle that looked like a child. I could see the shape of Jake's red jacket. I lunged forward, brandishing my knife, screaming Jake's name. The creature turned to face me. I realized with horror that it wore my son's face, stretched across its own skull, lips pulled back in a grotesque mockery of a smile. I froze, stomach churning, mind reeling. Lily sobbed, clinging to my arm. Then Sarah stepped forward again, her eyes glassy and unfocused. She reached out toward the creature, whispering something I couldn't make out. It took a step toward her. I watched in disbelief as Sarah's face started to contort, as if she was struggling against some invisible force. She glanced back at me and mouthed, "Run." But her body didn't move away. Instead, she crouched, like an animal about to pounce, then leaped at me. I barely managed to dodge. She crashed into the wall, howling in pain, then turned on Lily. Realizing I had no choice, I grabbed Sarah from behind, wrestling her arms away from Lily, and pinned her. Her skin felt feverish, her muscles twitching under my grip. I shouted her name, begging her to snap out of it, but she only snarled in response. The creature watched, fascinated, still holding that red jacket. Then it dropped the bundle. I heard a wet thump as it hit the ground. In that moment, I wasn't sure I could handle what I'd find inside. The creature advanced on me, moving with that horrifying, spider-like gait, claws extended from its fingers, and the stench of death rolling off it. I couldn't let it get closer. I released Sarah, who collapsed in a daze, and turned all my rage and terror on this monster. With a roar, I slashed at it, but it was so fast that I barely grazed its side. It shrieked, a sound that made my blood freeze, and lashed out, knocking me onto my back. Pain exploded across my rib cage. I heard Lily scream. The creature bounded forward, pouncing onto Sarah. She didn't even have time to cry out before it clamped its jaws around her throat. Her eyes widened in shock, and she reached a trembling hand toward me. Blood erupted, painting the cave floor. Lily let out a soul-wrenching wail as the creature tore Sarah's throat free. Something shattered inside me. For a moment, I was sure I'd die of heartbreak right there. But Lily was still alive, and I had to protect her. My mind went blank with fury. I lunged up, grabbing a jagged branch that had fallen from the cave ceiling. I drove it into the monster's back with all my strength. It screamed, flailing, releasing Sarah's body. That's when Lily grabbed my arm and pulled me backward. My wife lay motionless, eyes open but vacant. The creature twisted around, reaching for me, but Lily dragged me away. She sobbed, tears streaming down her cheeks, and shouted something about setting it on fire. I spotted a small canister of camp fuel in the corner. Likely ours. Dragged here by that thing after it ransacked our gear. How or why it ended up in this chamber, I couldn't guess. But I wasn't about to question our luck. Lily snatched the canister and splashed the creature with the liquid. It shrieked, flailing its arms as the pungent smell of gasoline filled the cave. I fumbled for the lighter in my pocket, my hands shaking so badly I could hardly flick the flame. But I managed, and the second the lighter sparked, Lily threw a warded up cloth, doused in fuel at the beast. Flames roared to life, licking across its torso. The creature howled, a nightmarish shriek that echoed off the stone walls, then scrambled away, its flesh crackling. The smell was unbearable. Lily and I grabbed each other and sprinted from the cave, tears blurring my vision. We left Sarah's body behind. My mind couldn't process what that meant. I only knew we had to survive. By the time we burst into the open air, the fire had spread behind us, sending thick smoke out of the cave mouth. We half ran, half stumbled through the trees, not knowing where we were going, only that we needed to get away. I clung to Lily's hand and prayed we'd find a road, or some sign of civilization. My ribs ached, my throat felt raw from smoke, and my legs threatened to give out. Somehow, by sheer fortune, we reached a dirt road after hours of stumbling in the darkness. Dawn was creeping over the horizon. My heart pounded as we saw headlights in the distance, a pickup truck. I flagged it down, ignoring how wild I must have looked. The driver, An older man in a flannel shirt looked at us like we were half crazy, but he helped us into the truck without questions. Lily collapsed onto the seat, sobbing quietly. I had no words to offer her, no comfort. All I could do was hold her close and whisper that we were safe now. We never found Jake's body. We never found anything that confirmed he was dead or alive. And to this day, I don't know if that means there's still hope, or if the creature claimed him in ways too awful to imagine. The police searched the forest, but they concluded that an animal attack must have killed Sarah and Jake, though they couldn't explain the missing remains or the burned cave. Officially, it's an unsolved case. Lily stays with my sister now. She can barely sleep without a light on, and she refuses to ever speak about what happened in the woods. As for me, I'm haunted every night by the sight of that thing wearing my son's face and the sound of Sarah's last wet gasp. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I hear a child's voice calling for help. Jake's voice. I wake up with sweat dripping down my back, unsure if the voice was in my head, or if the monster is still out there, taunting me. I've tried to put the memory behind me, but I can't. The forest near Naun claimed half my family and every shred of security I ever felt. What I saw in that cave defies my understanding of the world. Maybe you're reading this, thinking I'm just spinning a story, that none of it could be real. I almost wish you were right. But I know what I heard, what I saw. Something's out there, something that can mimic our voices, our faces, even our loved ones. And it's waiting for anyone foolish enough to venture too far from the safety of civilization. If you ever find yourself near Naun, Indiana, remember this story. And if you hear a familiar voice calling out to you from the darkness, no matter how desperately it sounds, don't follow it, run. It's not a fun one, but it's one people need to hear. My name's Alex Riley, I'm 37, and I'm about to tell you how I messed up big time. All because I couldn't leave well enough alone. See, I've always been obsessed with folklore, spooky stories, that kind of thing. My friend, Sarah Jenkins, she was a historian, a year younger than me, super smart and usually the sensible one. We made a good team. Her groundedness balancing out my, let's say, enthusiasm. This whole nightmare started with whispers about a place called Serpent Spine, part of the Blackwood Forest up in North Dakota. Locals told tales of an old witch living out there. They called her Grandma Willow. Sounds harmless enough, right? Like some kindly old woman baking cookies. Wrong. This was the kind of witch that gave you chills, the kind that made you lock your doors at night. People said she controlled the forest, that folks who wandered in too deep sometimes never came out, vanished like smoke. Now, most people, they hear stories like that, they steer clear. Not me. My ears perked up. My brain started buzzing. This was the kind of story I lived for. Sarah, bless her heart, tried to talk me out of it. It's just local legends, Alex, she'd say, tall tales to scare the tourists. But the more she resisted, the more I wanted to go. And like a fool, I convinced her to come along. Think of the research, I said. We'll write a paper that'll blow everyone away. So, we packed our bags and headed to Blackwood Falls, the closest town to Serpent Spine. Picture this, a town straight out of a creepy movie. One main street, a couple of dusty shops, and locals who looked like they hadn't smiled in a decade. Every time I asked about Grandma Willow, I got the same reaction. Doors slammed in my face, hushed warnings to stay away, or this creepy whisper, don't go looking for what ain't meant to be found. Instead of, listening, this just fueled my fire. I was like a moth to a flame, except the flame was probably going to burn me alive. I was determined to find this witch's territory. We needed a guide, someone who knew the woods. That's where we met Caleb Hayes. Mid-20s, but he looked way older. He had this permanent frown etched on his face, and these haunted eyes, like he'd seen things he wished he could unsee. Caleb was hesitant, to say the least. Didn't want anything to do with us or our crazy witch hunt. But money talks, and we were offering enough to make him reconsider. I still remember the way his hand shook when he finally agreed. Looking back, I realized that wasn't excitement. That was pure, unadulterated terror. We loaded up on supplies, or what we thought were supplies. Our budget was tight, so I skimped on some things. Figured we'd be in and out, quick trip. We had some basic tents, a bit of food, and this crappy handheld radio that barely picked up static. Sarah, being the practical one, packed a first aid kit and a proper map. Thank goodness. But even her usual caution took a backseat to my crazy drive. I think she trusted me too much. And I definitely trusted myself too much. The next morning, we set off. Serpent Spine wasn't a mountain, like the name suggested. More like a maze of dense woods, thick undergrowth, and these weird, jagged cliffs that seemed to jut out of nowhere. The deeper we went, the further away from civilization we felt. Cell service died. The paved road turned to gravel, then to a muddy track, and finally, we had to ditch the car and hike. By late afternoon, we made camp in a small clearing. The trees were so thick overhead that the sunlight barely filtered through, turning everything this weird, greenish color. The wind was whistling through the branches, making these eerie sounds. That's when the first truly strange thing happened. We heard a wolf howl echoing in the distance. Okay, normal enough, right? But then came another howl, slightly off, like a person trying to imitate a wolf badly. It sent shivers down my spine. I saw Caleb's face go pale. Sarah tried to brush it off, saying it was probably just a coyote with a weird bark. But even she sounded spooked. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of a branch, every rustle in the leaves had me jumping. My head was swimming with all those old stories, witches brewing potions, chanting under the moon. I finally drifted off, only to be jolted awake sometime after midnight. I heard this rustling outside my tent, followed by a muffled shriek. I threw open the flap, and there was Sarah, standing by the dying embers of our campfire, staring into the darkness, eyes wide as saucers. When I called her name, she nearly jumped out of her skin. I saw something, she whispered, her voice trembling. A person, or maybe an animal. It was just there. Caleb poked his head out of his tent, looking like he'd been expecting something like this to happen all along. He checked around the camp, but there was nothing, except for a bunch of branches broken off in a weird, almost deliberate pattern. We tried to go back to sleep, but the rest of the night was a blur of uneasy silence and those off-kilter howls that sounded way too human. Let me tell you, nothing makes you feel more alone and vulnerable than being in the middle of nowhere, in the dark, with sounds you can't explain. And this was just the beginning. Morning finally came, and let me tell you, I've never been so happy to see the sun. Even if it was just those weak rays filtering through the trees. We packed up our gear, eager to put some distance between us and that creepy campsite. The second day's hike took us deeper into the heart of Blackwood Forest, and the place just kept getting weirder. The trees seemed to twist and turn in unnatural ways, the air felt heavy, and I swear the shadows were watching us. Then, we stumbled upon something that instantly set my nerves on fire. We found this clearing, a perfect circle of dead trees, not just dead, but stripped bare. The bark was peeled off, revealing these crude symbols carved into the trunks, like something out of a horror movie. The ground in the center was scorched black, and the whole place smelled like death, like a rotting animal. Now, any sane person would have turned around and walked away. But me, I felt this weird pull, this compulsion to document it all. I told Sarah to set up her camera, get some shots of the symbols, while I scribbled down notes. Caleb, though, he hung back, refusing to even step foot inside the circle. He muttered something about it being cursed ground, and how we were messing with things we shouldn't. For once, I didn't argue. There was something about that place, something deeply unsettling, that even I couldn't ignore. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. We didn't stay long. Even I had my limits. But as we moved on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd crossed some kind of line. Like we'd triggered something. Night came fast, and we decided to camp right at the edge of that creepy tree circle. Sarah, even though she was uneasy, agreed because she wanted better light for photos in the morning. Caleb muttered that this was a terrible idea, that we should move on, find safer ground. But he didn't protest too strongly. Maybe he feared we'd blame him if anything went wrong, or maybe he just felt stuck with two fools who wouldn't listen. That night, I sat by the fire, poring over my notes. The old legends said Grandma Willow could bend the forest to her will. She'd lure people in with voices of loved ones, then offer them twisted bargains to let them leave. Sounded like nonsense, like made-up stories to scare kids. But the longer I stared at those dead trees, the more my skepticism started to crack. Sometime after midnight, I woke up with the strangest sensation. My body felt weightless, like I was sleepwalking. I stood up and, without even thinking, walked straight into that circle of dead trees. I remember hearing this low humming sound, almost like a melody, but distorted. It made no sense, but I couldn't stop. My legs felt like they were being guided by some invisible force. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the center of the circle, arms outstretched, like some kind of human sacrifice. Sarah and Caleb were shouting my name from the edge, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like tiny, desperate stars. My voice was caught in my throat. I had no idea how I'd gotten there. One minute I was in my tent. The next I was in the middle of a cursed circle, playing out some twisted ritual. When I finally snapped out of it, I was shaking. Sarah was frantic, Caleb just looked grim, like he'd seen this all before. We decided right then and there, we were getting out of there. Whatever curiosity had driven me was gone, replaced by a cold, hard fear. But when we started packing up, we realized something was very, very wrong. Someone or something had messed with our supplies. A good chunk of our food was gone, vanished into thin air. And, worst of all, our map was burnt, still smoldering at the edges, like someone had deliberately set it on fire. Panic started to set in. We had no way of knowing if it was an accident or deliberate sabotage. Caleb lost it, started yelling at me, accusing me of stirring up dark forces by stepping into that circle. I yelled back, saying maybe he'd done it. Maybe he was trying to scare us off. Sarah tried to calm us down, but it was no use. The thin thread of trust between us was starting to unravel. Without a map, we were lost. We had to rely on Caleb's memory of the woods, but even that seemed unreliable. Every trail we took, every path we followed, seemed to lead us right back to that same circle of dead trees. It was like the forest was playing tricks on us, messing with our minds. We'd see things out of the corner of our eyes, glimpses of movement, only to find it was just swaying branches. And those howls from the previous night, they started up again, but closer now, more urgent, more human. By late afternoon, we found ourselves back at the circle for the third time. That's when Caleb really started to lose it. He wouldn't admit he was scared, but the sweat was pouring down his face, and his voice was trembling whenever he spoke. Sarah and I were fighting our own rising panic, trying to find some logical explanation for why we couldn't escape this cursed spot. Then, we heard it. A scream echoing through the trees. It was faint but unmistakable, and it changed everything. Caleb's whole demeanor shifted. He shouted Maria. Before taking off running into the woods, deeper into the trees. We had no idea who Maria was, but Sarah and I chased after him, not even thinking, just reacting. Branches whipped at our faces. The uneven ground threatened to twist our ankles, but we kept going, following the sound of Caleb's frantic calls. We ran for what felt like forever, maybe half an hour, fueled by adrenaline and a growing sense of dread. Finally, we found him, and it wasn't a pretty sight. Caleb was dangling from a low branch, unconscious, caught in some kind of makeshift snare around his leg. His arms hung limp, and his face was streaked with blood from these shallow claw marks. It looked like some kind of animal had gotten to him, or something worse. I quickly cut him down, nearly throwing out my own shoulder in the process. Once we got him on the ground, he came to, eyes wild, darting around like a cornered animal. He kept muttering about hearing his sister's voice, calling for help. Sarah and I exchanged worried glances. Neither of us had heard anything but Caleb's own shouts. While I was still trying to make sense of it, Caleb lurched forward and grabbed my shirt, his grip surprisingly strong. "She's out there," he gasped, his breath ragged. "She disappeared years ago, in these woods, but I heard her. I heard Maria." We tried to calm him down, but he was beyond reason. He'd grown up around here, he said, and his sister had vanished in these same woods, just like the legend said. Lost to Grandma Willow. It all sounded too crazy, too convenient, but the look in his eyes, the raw terror, it was hard to dismiss. As dusk settled in, we realized we'd lost all track of time chasing after Caleb. The forest was getting dangerously dark. We didn't want to spend another night near that cursed circle, so we hiked a short distance and set up a makeshift camp. Nobody spoke much. Even Sarah was at a loss for words. We were exhausted, hungry, scared, and completely and utterly lost. And the worst was yet to come. The middle of the night. Pitch black. I woke up with a jolt, my heart hammering in my chest. Something was wrong. I scrambled out of my tent and saw it immediately. Sarah's tent was wide open, flapping in the wind. Empty. Panic gripped through me. I ran outside, and there they were, footprints in the soft dirt, leading away from the camp, deeper into the forest. Sarah's footprints. Caleb staggered awake, still groggy and in pain from his leg, but he didn't hesitate. He grabbed a flashlight, and we took off after her, leaving the tents behind, stumbling through the undergrowth. Those footprints were the only clue we had. The forest was unnervingly quiet now. No howls, no distant movement, just this oppressive silence that pressed down on us like a physical weight, and the relentless pounding of my heart, a drumbeat of dread in the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, maybe an hour of tracking, we stumbled upon a hidden opening in the ground. It looked like an old mine shaft, or maybe a cave entrance, half concealed by overgrown bushes. And the footprints, they disappeared right into it. We descended into darkness, our weak flashlight beams barely cutting through the thick, suffocating black. The air down there was cold and stale, smelling of mold and damp earth, with a coppery tang I couldn't place, but instantly disliked. Deeper in, we found a chamber, and that's when things went from bad to horrific. The chamber was lit by these flickering torches stuck into the rocky walls, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist on their own. My eyes were immediately drawn to a makeshift altar in the center, made of rough, hewn stone. It was surrounded by those same carved symbols we'd seen on the dead trees, only these were bigger, more elaborate, more menacing. And then I saw them, figures lurking at the edges of the light. They looked human at first glance, but they moved in this jerky, unnatural way, like puppets on strings. And in the middle of it all, bound and gagged, was Sarah. Her eyes were wide with terror, and I saw blood on her wrists where the ropes were biting into her skin. My throat closed up. I wanted to scream, to charge in, but I was frozen. This was it. This was the heart of the darkness. This was Grandma Willow's lair. I rushed forward, a primal scream building in my throat, but one of the figures moved with blinding speed, shoving me back with a strength that was inhuman. I went flying, landing hard on my back, the wind knocked out of me. Caleb tried to help, but then something else stepped out of the shadows. It was tall and angular, draped in tattered robes that seemed to blend into the darkness. Its limbs were unnaturally long, almost skeletal. Its face was half hidden by a hood, but I caught a glimpse of a mouth stretched into a wide, horrifying grin. This had to be her, Grandma Willow, the witch of the legends. She didn't speak, not in any language I understood. Instead, she let out this low, croaking laugh that seemed to vibrate in my bones, a sound that promised pain and despair. The figures closed in, restraining us both, their grip like iron. They dragged us towards Sarah, forcing us to kneel before the altar. Then, the witch raised her hands. They were gnarled and twisted, like the branches of the dead trees, her fingers tipped with long, claw-like nails. She began to chant, a low, guttural sound that made my ears ring and my vision blur. I watched helpless as Sarah screamed in agony. One of the figures pressed a hot iron brand against her shoulder, right above her collarbone. The smell of burning flesh filled the chamber, a sickeningly sweet odor that made my stomach churn. I tried to lunge forward, to fight, but I was held back, my muscles screaming in protest. And then, in a twist I never saw coming, Caleb started talking. He was pleading with the witch, begging her to let him go. He said he'd do anything, if she spared him. My mind struggled to process what I was hearing. This was betrayal, pure and simple. The fear in his eyes was gone, replaced by a desperate, chilling resolve. In a trembling voice, Caleb revealed he'd known about the witch all along. He said the people in Blackwood Falls offered sacrifices to keep her appeased. He admitted he was the one who had sabotaged our map, who had let the food disappear. He'd led us deeper into her domain, knowing she'd take us, so he and the others in town would be safe. He was a Judah's goat, leading us to the slaughter. Realization washed over me, cold and bitter. From the beginning, Caleb's fear wasn't just about superstition. He'd known exactly what he was leading us into. He was part of it. The witch let out another one of those awful laughs and seized Caleb by the arm. For a second, I thought she might actually spare him. But then, with a swift, brutal movement, she dragged him backward, his body going limp as his head snapped back with a sickening crack. Caleb's screams echoed through the cavern as he disappeared into a dark tunnel, the other figures following close behind. They left me and Sarah alone, bound and helpless on the cold, stony floor of that cursed place. I'm not sure how long they were gone. Time lost all meaning in that underground hell. Every second felt like an eternity, every shadow a potential threat. Eventually, they returned. But Caleb wasn't with them. I don't know what they did to him, but the echoes of his screams still lingered in the air, a chilling reminder of his betrayal and his gruesome fate. The witch, Grandma Willow, she just stood there, that awful grin still plastered on her face. Then she beckoned to the remaining figures, and they began this twisted ceremony around Sarah. She was barely conscious by then, probably from the pain and the blood loss. My body shook with rage, fear, and a helplessness so profound it was suffocating. But then, in the midst of the chaos, one of the figures stumbled, knocking over a torch. The flame caught on a patch of dried moss on the cave floor. It wasn't much, just a small fire, but it was enough. A distraction. With the light flickering erratically, casting even more bizarre shadows, I saw my chance. I managed to twist my hands, still bound behind my back, under my legs, and then up in front of me. My wrists felt raw, scraped bloody by the ropes. But adrenaline is a powerful thing. It fueled me. I tackled the nearest figure, knocking him off balance, and grabbed the fallen torch. I swung it wildly, a desperate attempt to keep the others at bay. They hissed and recoiled from the flames, these creatures of darkness shrinking from the light. I rushed to Sarah. She was semi-conscious, her eyes fluttering. I used a jagged rock to saw through her bindings. She whimpered in pain but managed to stand, leaning heavily on me for support. Clutching the torch like a lifeline, we stumbled through the cavern, a desperate escape from that nightmarish place. The witch lunged at us, her elongated fingers grazing my shoulder. It felt like being raked by razor-sharp claws. I kicked backward, felt contact, heard a shriek of pain, and then we were running. Up the tunnel, half blind, hearts pounding like war drums in our chests. When we finally emerged into the cold night air, we didn't dare stop. We just ran. Sarah leaned on me heavily, her breath coming in ragged gasps. We forced ourselves onward, guided by the faint light of the moon. At some point, I realized we were near the circle of dead trees again. The forest still looked twisted and menacing, but we had no choice. We pushed on, fueled by desperation and the primal instinct to survive. By dawn, we stumbled upon a dirt road. My mind was a blur of terror and disbelief. Miraculously, we spotted an abandoned shack near the roadside. I used a broken piece of shelving to pry the lock on the door, and we collapsed inside. But Sarah was in bad shape. The brand on her shoulder was infected, oozing pus, and she was burning up with fever. She mumbled incoherent phrases, her eyes rolling back in her head. I tried to keep her awake, to keep her calm, but she'd thrash suddenly, as if possessed by nightmares. It took most of the day, but eventually, I flagged down a passing truck. The driver, a local farmer, took one look at Sarah's brand and his face turned grim. He helped us into the back, didn't ask many questions, just muttered, "You shouldn't have gone up there." He dropped us off at a small clinic in Blackwood Falls, then left without another word. Sarah's physical condition stabilized, but she wouldn't talk about what happened. Whenever I brought it up, she'd just shake her head, her eyes filled with this hollow, animal terror. At first, the townsfolk seemed sympathetic, but I felt this creeping unease. Whenever we mentioned the cavern or the witch, the nurses would glance at each other in this knowing way, like they were all in on some dark secret. I tried to tell myself it was just paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. One night, while Sarah was asleep in the clinic, I overheard two older women whispering in the hallway. One said, "She's been marked," and the other replied, "We have to give her back, or more will be taken." My blood ran cold. I confronted them, but they just avoided my questions and walked away, their faces pale and drawn. A few days later, Sarah's condition took a turn for the worse. She started speaking in this strange language, a language I'd never heard before. Sometimes she'd just whisper, other times she'd shout, her voice echoing through the clinic. The nurses turned pale, and the doctors kept their distance. I tried to stay by her side, but the staff insisted I leave her room at night. When I demanded answers, a local doctor finally broke down and admitted that some people believed the witch's curse had bound Sarah to Grandma Willow. He said people in Blackwood Falls sometimes vanished or turned violent if they were chosen. The night everything fell apart, I snuck into Sarah's room after hours, determined not to leave her alone. It was pitch black, except for the faint glow of the monitors. Suddenly, shapes flooded into the room. Dozens of people, wearing hooded cloaks, their footsteps silent on the linoleum floor. I yelled for help, but no one came. In a gruesome, practiced ritual, they lifted Sarah from her bed, half conscious and delirious, and carried her out a side door. I fought them, but I was outnumbered, overpowered. They pinned me down until I almost blacked out from lack of oxygen. By the time I freed myself, they were gone. The hallway was empty. The few staff members I found pretended they had no idea what I was talking about. I ran outside, screaming Sarah's name, stumbling through the deserted streets of Blackwood Falls. No lights came on. No one came to help me. It was as if the entire town had collectively decided to let her go. Eventually, I sank to my knees, defeated, broken. All I could see in my mind's eye was Sarah's battered face, the brand seared into her skin. I wondered if she had ever truly escaped the witch's grasp. Maybe the entire town was complicit, offering her as a sacrifice to keep their own families safe. I left Blackwood Falls the next morning. It's been weeks now, and I haven't slept more than an hour or two at a time. The nightmares always lead me back to that underground cavern, to the circle of dead trees, to the echo of Sarah's screams. Sometimes I dream of Caleb too, hearing the snap of his bones and his pleas for mercy. No one has reported seeing him since that night, which is no surprise. He chose self-preservation, and the witch took him anyway. Every time I close my eyes, I see the witch's face, the twisted grin half hidden in shadow. I wonder if she took Sarah back to the circle of dead trees to finish what she started. If she's being kept alive, or if she's become something else entirely. The guilt gnaws at me. I was the one who insisted on going there, who dragged Sarah along on my crazy quest for a story. Now, I'm left with more questions than answers. Was it all real? Or did I hallucinate some twisted piece of local folklore? The claw marks on my shoulder, the brand on Sarah's flesh, Caleb's disappearance. They're all too tangible for mere hallucinations. When I talk to people about it, they either think I'm delusional or warn me not to dig any deeper. But I can't stop. I can't just abandon Sarah. That's why I'm telling this story, as messed up as it is. Some part of me believes that if I shed light on what happened, maybe the witch's hold will weaken. Or maybe someone braver than me will succeed where I failed. All I know is that I'm haunted by the memory of that hooded figure and the knowledge that an entire town seemed complicit in an ancient horror. Whether or not anyone believes me, the truth remains. Blackwood Forest holds a darkness beyond comprehension, and Grandma Willow is real. She's out there, feeding on anyone reckless enough to venture into her domain. I'm not sure I'll ever find closure. Every night, I sit by a flickering lamp, scanning old books, clippings, searching for some shred of a cure, a ritual, anything that might break the witch's curse. But with every lead, I hit a dead end, and the people who know more refuse to speak. Sometimes, I think I hear Sarah's voice in the quiet, calling me back. The old me would have followed that voice without hesitation. But now, after everything I've witnessed, I'm not sure if I'd be walking into another trap set by Grandma Willow's servants. This is my confession, my warning, and my apology, all rolled into one. If you read this, and you're tempted to go searching the forests of Blackwood, don't. If you see the circle of dead trees, run the other way. And if you hear a voice calling your name at night, pray it's just the wind, because once the witch sets her eyes on you, there may be no escape. I paid in blood and suffering for my obsession. I may never get Sarah back. So heed my words, or you too might find yourself ensnared in the shadows of Blackwood Forest. Another grim chapter in the legend of Grandma Willow. My name is Sarah Miller, I'm 26, and let me tell you, I used to think ghosts and local legends were total BS. That was before Blackwood Lake, in Perry County, Indiana, happened. It was the summer of my last year of grad school, and it totally changed my life. I was at Indiana University, studying ecology, plants and stuff, specifically wetlands. My best friend, Chloe, who was basically the opposite of me, talked me into spending a weekend at Blackwood Lake. Chloe was all about that adrenaline junkie life. She had this little YouTube channel where she'd go to supposedly haunted places and film it. Me, I was the cautious one, the bookworm. Definitely not the type to go looking for trouble. But Chloe kept going on about these rare plants I could collect for my research, and honestly, we hadn't hung out in forever, so I cave. We packed up Chloe's beat, up old Jeep on a Friday afternoon, and drove the 2 hours southwest from Bloomington. The whole way there, Chloe wouldn't shut up about the local legend. Hikers disappearing, a freaky lady in white roaming the shore at night, wailing like a banshee. The whole 9 yards. Supposedly, this ghost was cursed to lure people to a watery grave. Chloe was obsessed with this stuff. I just rolled my eyes, figuring it was just stories to freak out the tourists. But when we finally hit that gravel road leading down to Blackwood Lake, my stomach did a little flip-flop. The trees got thicker, the road got narrower, and soon the Jeep was bouncing around like crazy, dodging potholes. Chloe was all excited, pointing at the creepy trees and saying how great the footage would be. I tried to focus on my research and the cool plants I might find, but I had no idea that none of that was going to matter. Not at all. Blackwood Lake wasn't exactly a postcard. The water was dark and murky, with these weird, swollen cypress trees lining the edges. Patches of thick weeds broke the surface. It was strangely quiet. We parked in this little dirt clearing, like 15 minutes from the main trail. There were no real campsites, just a messed up sign half buried in the mud that said, "No trespassing beyond this point. Unexplained drownings." Yeah, real inviting. Chloe just shrugged it off, saying it was just to scare people. We started unloading our gear, and right away, I could tell we were screwed. The tent Chloe borrowed had a bunch of tiny holes. The battery-powered lantern kept flickering, and then we found out Chloe had forgotten, like, half the food she was supposed to bring. My anxiety started to kick in. I tried to stay positive, reminding myself it was just a short trip. In and out, grab some plants, film some stuff, maybe have a campfire. Easy peasy. Boy, was I wrong. Night came fast. The lake's still water reflected a sliver of moonlight. We built a small fire, using the damp wood we could find, and huddled around it, grateful for the warmth. Chloe, of course, launched into one of her spooky stories. "You know," she said, her voice all hushed and dramatic, "people say they hear a woman crying at night. She sounds like someone they know, calling for help. Then, they follow that voice into the swamp, and they're never seen again." I forced a laugh. "Pretty sure it's just the wind, Chloe." She just smirked at me. "We'll see." We talked for another hour about grad school drama and her YouTube dreams. I was starting to doze off when I heard it. This faint, sad crying sound echoing across the water. Chloe instantly stiffened, grabbing her phone to record. We both listened, hearts pounding. Was it just a loon or some other bird? It sounded eerily human. Despite a prickling fear, I tried to be rational. "There are plenty of animals that make weird sounds at night," I whispered. "We should turn in." Chloe nodded, though reluctantly, and we retreated into the crappy tent. I listened to that whimpering noise for another hour before exhaustion finally pulled me under. The next morning, sunlight was filtering through the tent holes, all warm on my face. I crawled outside, and wow, the lake was actually kind of pretty in the early morning. There was this mist hanging over the dark water, and it was all calm and peaceful, but still kind of eerie, you know. I got busy collecting soil and water samples, carefully labeling each tube. It felt good to slip back into my scientist routine. Chloe joined me after a while, camera in hand, of course. "Let's explore," she said, motioning to the far side of the lake. I hesitated. Our gear was already a joke, but whatever, I gave in. We started walking along the edge of the lake, and the ground got really soggy, the mud sucking at our boots. About 20 minutes in, we stumbled on something that made my stomach drop. It was an old campsite, all messed up and half buried in the mud. There was a collapsed tent, a sleeping bag ripped open, and stuff scattered everywhere, a hiking boot, a wet notebook with the pages all stuck together. It was like whoever was here left in a major hurry. Or something made them leave in a hurry. "Whoa," Chloe murmured. "Someone left in a hurry, or something forced them out." I swallowed hard. "We should head back, Chloe. This doesn't look good." But Chloe, being Chloe, started digging through the stuff. She pulled out the notebook. The ink was all smeared, but I could make out a few words. Heard the crying again, going to look, and then it was just a mess of black lines. My scalp prickled. "Let's go," I said, a little more forcefully this time. Chloe nodded, stuffing the notebook into her camera bag. The rest of the day was super slow. We went back to our site, where the fire was totally out. I told Chloe we should pack up and leave, but she refused. She was all like, "We've only just begun investigating. I've got barely any footage." I wanted to argue, but I saw this look in her eyes, this desperation. She was so set on making this YouTube thing work, and she hated the thought of quitting. Against my better judgment, I gave in. If I'd known what was going to happen, I would have dragged her back to the Jeep right then. That night, we tried to fish, hoping to get some actual food, but no luck. Everything felt too quiet, like all the animals were hiding. As it got dark, this thin mist rolled in over the water, and the temperature dropped like a rock. We built another fire and sat close, trying to stay warm. Chloe was messing with her camera, rewatching the day's footage. It was quiet, except for the crackling fire. And then, we heard it again. That crying. It was closer now, and even worse, it sounded like my mom. My throat went tight. My mom had passed away about a year ago. "Help me," the voice whispered. It was her voice, the exact same voice I'd grown up with. It was like a punch to the gut. Ice filled my veins. Chloe realized something was wrong. "Sarah," she asked. Softly, I couldn't speak. I was shaking all over. The voice kept calling, "Sarah, help me." And tears stung my eyes. Every rational part of me was screaming that this was impossible, that it couldn't be real. But that wounded part of me, the part that still missed my mom so much, wanted to run toward that voice. By the time I snapped out of it, Chloe was already grabbing a flashlight. "I need to see this up close," she said. "I need to find out where it's coming from." "No," I croaked. "It's a trap. That's what the ghost does. It mimics people you love." Chloe actually had the nerve to grin, though it looked forced. "Come on, Sarah, just a quick peek. I'll be safe." Before I could stop her, she took off into the shadows. I scrambled after her, my heart hammering. The darkness swallowed us up. Our flashlight beams were bouncing all over the place, hitting twisted branches and murky water. The crying kept echoing, moving around, like it was trying to lure us deeper in. "Chloe," I hissed. "Stay close." But she was already way ahead of me, not even paying attention to the mud or anything. Suddenly, she stopped and pointed. She whispered. I saw it too. A figure standing in the water, about waist deep. It was wearing a tattered white dress, and its hair was all matted and black, covering most of its face. It wasn't moving, except for this slow, creepy head tilt. My flashlight was shaking like crazy, the beam dancing on the water. "Help me," the figure said again. Only now, its voice was different. It didn't sound like my mom anymore. It was hollow and wrong. It rose to a wail, and my blood ran cold. Chloe took a step closer. And then, the thing, if it even was a woman, threw its head back and let out this shriek, so loud and piercing, It felt like my eardrums were going to explode. Pain ripped through my head, and I dropped to my knees, clutching my ears. The darkness started closing in around the edges of my vision. When the scream finally stopped, I forced myself to look up. Chloe was just standing there in the water, staring at the thing. Her eyes were blank. The thing's mouth twisted into this awful smile. I stumbled forward, grabbed Chloe's arm, and yanked her back. She barely reacted, like a rag doll. We half ran, half crawled back to our campsite. My ears were ringing, and there was blood trickling from them. Chloe's eyes were distant, and she was mumbling nonsense about children, about voices calling her home. I was so terrified, I could barely think. It took hours for Chloe to snap out of her daze, and even then, something about her was off. She didn't say much, and when she did, her voice was all hoarse, like she'd been screaming. And she refused to leave the next morning. She was totally fixated on finding the source of the crying, convinced we were on to something big. I stared at her, feeling both angry and worried. Chloe, that thing nearly blew out our eardrums. Let's get out of here and call for help. That campsite we found, those people might be missing or worse. She scowled, her eyes flickering with an intensity I'd never seen before. So, you're fine letting the world believe this is just some hoax? Don't you want to know the truth? I realized I couldn't reason with her. She was too far gone, maybe possessed, maybe just obsessed. My ears still ached, and I knew we had to get out of there. I started packing up our stuff. Chloe just sat there, motionless, muttering under her breath about finding the children. It was chilling. Suddenly, she jumped up and bolted into the woods again. Chloe, I shouted, racing after her. I ran after Chloe, my boots slipping in the mud, branches whipping my face. I lost sight of her for a terrifying minute, then I heard her cry out in panic. I followed the sound and burst into a small clearing, and there she was, Chloe, tied to a crude wooden post, thick ropes around her wrists and torso. 3 figures in burlap masks and ragged clothing surrounded her, chanting in these low, creepy voices. Each one held a makeshift weapon, an axe, a rusty knife, a club. My heart slammed against my ribs. I screamed, stepping forward. Leave her alone. They whipped around to face me. Through one of the masks, I saw eyes gleaming with this freaky, unholy zeal. Before I could react, something hard smacked against the back of my skull, and I went down hard. I woke up with a splitting headache. My wrists were tied behind me, and my ankles were bound together, the rope biting into my skin. I was lying on cold, damp ground, still somewhere near the lake, I guessed. Slowly I forced my eyes open. It was night again, or maybe I'd been out all day. It was hard to tell. I heard a whimper close by. Turning my head, I saw Chloe. She was tied up too, lying about a foot away. Her face was pale, her lips cracked. The look in her eyes told me she was just as terrified as I was, but she was trying to act tough, like always. When her eyes met mine, she mouthed, "I'm sorry." We were in this messed up campsite, lit by flickering torches. The same 3 masked freaks were standing nearby, watching us, occasionally casting glances our way as they prepared something by the fire. It was a large metal pot, or cauldron, and my stomach lurched at the possibilities. A few yards away, there were these strange figures made of sticks and bones, hanging from the cypress branches. They looked vaguely human, with twisted limbs and hollow eye sockets, creepy as hell. One of the masked figures approached us. His mask had some kind of black paint on it, forming a hideous grin. He yanked me upright by the rope around my wrists, and I cried out as pain shot through my shoulders. He spoke in a low, gravelly voice. "The swamp needs a sacrifice," he said. "She demands an offering." I tried to steady my breathing. Who are you?" I managed, my voice trembling. He laughed, the sound muffled by the burlap. We are the devoted. We've watched this land for generations, ensuring the banshee's hunger is sated. He jerked his head at Chloe. She was messing with forces beyond her understanding. Chloe let out a shaky breath. We didn't mean to. Silence. Another masked figure snarled, kicking her in the stomach. Chloe doubled over, coughing in pain. My pulse was hammering. I instinctively tried to move toward her, but the man holding me wrenched the ropes tighter. They dragged us to the edge of the lake, forcing us to kneel in the swampy grass. The water was dark and still, and it reeked of decay. One of the devoted shoved a cloth into Chloe's mouth, gagging her. Then, he tied a heavy rock to her ankles with thick rope. My own panic went through the roof. I was sure they were going to do the same to me. Torchlight flickered on the water's surface. In the distance, I heard a faint cry. A woman's voice carried on the breeze. The banshee. The cultists began chanting, their voices mixing with the distant wailing. My stomach twisted in pure terror. They moved to push Chloe into the water. Desperation took over. I clenched my fists behind my back, feeling around for anything sharp. My fingers brushed a jagged piece of rock stuck in the mud. With trembling concentration, I started sawing at the rope. It was slow going, each movement a risk of being caught. Tears streaked down Chloe's face as she tried to scream against the gag. One of the cultists pressed a boot to her shoulder, ready to tip her into the lake. I slashed frantically at the rope. A strand snapped, then another. Finally, it gave way, and my wrists came free. I lunged at the boot on Chloe's shoulder, tackling the figure into the shallow water. He let out a guttural cry as we splashed. My shoulder screamed in pain from the impact, but adrenaline kept me going. Another cultist swung at me with a club, and I dodged the blow, whirling past my ear. I grabbed the submerged boot of my attacker and yanked, pulling him back into the lake. He sputtered and cursed, scrambling onto land. I fumbled to untie my ankles. The ropes were knotted tight, so I used the jagged rock again. Meanwhile, Chloe was wrestling with the man trying to push her in. With her hands still bound, she couldn't get much leverage, but her foot kicked him square in the gut, knocking the wind out of him. The third cultist rushed forward, brandishing a knife. I managed to free one foot and lashed out, tripping him. He went tumbling, the knife skidding away. In the confusion, I freed Chloe's hands and pulled the gag from her mouth. She gasped for air. Together, we stumbled away from the water, ignoring the cultists' shouts behind us. We ran blindly into the swampy forest. Branches whipped our faces, and gnarled roots threatened to trip us. The ground squelched underfoot. We didn't dare turn on a flashlight, for fear of being spotted. Overhead, the moon was just a sliver, giving us barely enough light to see. My lungs burned, my heart was a jackhammer, but we couldn't stop. Behind us, I heard the distant calls and footfalls of our pursuers. Occasionally, a torch's glow flitted through the trees. Chloe clutched my arm, limping from the earlier kick. We hid behind a fallen log, pressing our bodies into the mud, waiting for the torchlight to pass. Then, we crept further until we saw a faint clearing up ahead. Relief surged through me when I recognized the shape of the battered jeep. We'd looped back near our original campsite. "Come on," I whispered. We reached the jeep and yanked on the doors. Locked. But Chloe had the keys around her neck on a lanyard. She fumbled with shaky hands. Unlocking the driver's side, we tumbled inside. I twisted the key in the ignition. The engine groaned and refused to turn over. My heart plummeted. Outside, footsteps crunched. A voice hissed in the darkness, "They're here somewhere." Fear shot through me. I pumped the gas pedal, turned the key again, praying. Finally, it coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. Headlights flared, illuminating two burlap, masked figures running at us with knives raised. Chloe slammed the jeep into reverse, and we lurched backward, tires spinning in the mud. The cultists' faces twisted in the beams of the headlights. One hurled his knife, which clanged off the hood. We tore away from the campsite, bouncing violently over roots and potholes. The road was barely visible. My hands shook on the wheel as I tried to keep us from crashing into the trees. When we hit the main gravel track, I risked a glance at Chloe. She sat in the passenger seat, arms wrapped around herself, tears streaking the mud caked on her cheeks. We both breathed raggedly, our adrenaline crashing. "We got away," I choked out, my voice trembling. But as soon as I said it, an unearthly wail echoed through the woods. It rose and fell, sending goosebumps across my skin. The banshee's cry. My vision blurred with tears, half from pain, half from sheer terror. The road curved sharply, and the jeep's tires skidded on loose gravel. We nearly flew into a ditch but managed to regain control. Everything inside me screamed to keep driving, to keep fleeing until we were far from this cursed place. But nature had another plan. The jeep jolted and died, the engine sputtering its final breath.
No, no, no.
Chloe wailed, pounding the dashboard. I twisted the key, but only silence greeted me. I grabbed my phone. Zero signal, the nearest town was miles away. We huddled in the jeep, windows rolled up, hearts pounding. Outside, the forest swayed in the night breeze. Then, from somewhere behind us, came a low scraping sound. I realized, with growing dread, that we were still being followed. Chloe let out a strangled sob. "They'll find us. We can't stay here." We forced ourselves out of the car, scanning our surroundings. The only way out was this overgrown logging road, leading away from the main track. We took it, pushing through chest-high weeds. My entire body ached, but fear kept me moving. After a few minutes, the weeds gave way to a narrower trail, and that's when we saw them, more of those creepy stick and bone figures dangling from the trees. It felt like the whole forest was watching us, judging us. We crept forward until we saw a flicker of light ahead. To our horror, we stumbled into another clearing, dotted with torches. Several small wooden structures, shacks or lean-tos, crouched among the trees. Movement caught my eye. A half-dozen masked figures stood near a fire pit, their chanting growing louder as we approached. Before we could back away, one of them turned and shouted. Torchlight glinted off a knife. They rushed at us. Chloe grabbed my hand. We bolted in the opposite direction, but two shapes emerged from the darkness, blocking our path. One tackled Chloe to the ground. She screamed, kicking wildly. I swung my fist at the attacker, connecting with something solid. He staggered, giving Chloe a moment to scramble free. We darted aside, weaving between the shacks, hearts pounding. Something wet and cold brushed against my face. I realized the ground sloped downward, toward a narrow stream that fed into the lake. We had nowhere to go but deeper into the swamp or back toward the cultists. The memory of nearly being sacrificed made me sick. Suddenly, an ear-splitting cry tore through the clearing. The banshee's wail. It was impossibly loud, causing everyone, cultists, me, Chloe, to drop to our knees, clutching our ears. This time, blood poured from my nose and the corners of my eyes. The pain was excruciating. The wail persisted, each note slicing through my skull like broken glass. Dimly, I saw the cultists convulse, some collapsing. One tried to cover his ears but staggered into the fire. A horrifying scream, of a different kind, rose as flames licked at his clothing. Chloe was on all fours, trembling, tears mingling with blood. Through the blur, I glimpsed a pale figure gliding out of the trees. The banshee. She moved like a wisp of fog, her tattered white dress drifting around her. With a final shriek, she advanced on the nearest cultist, her mouth distorting into an inhuman gape. I heard the wet crunch of flesh and bone, and my stomach churned. I forced myself to move. Grabbing Chloe's arm, I tried to drag her away. She resisted, eyes locked on the banshee, entranced. "Come on," I screamed, ignoring the agony in my head, but she pulled back. The children," she mumbled, as if in a trance. Before I could respond, the banshee's gaze snapped toward us. Her eyes, black pits streaming tears of blood, fixed on Chloe. With supernatural speed, she lunged forward, her scream renewing. Chloe's face twisted in terror. She tried to stand, but the banshee was upon her, arms outstretched. I grabbed a broken torch and swung wildly, hoping to fend off the creature. The banshee let out a hiss, batting me aside with terrible force. I flew back, slamming into the trunk of a cypress tree. My vision exploded into stars. When I managed to right myself, I saw the banshee dragging Chloe toward the stream. Chloe clawed at the muddy bank, screaming my name. The water splashed, swirling around them in dark eddies. I staggered forward, delirious with pain, attempting one last rescue. But the current was surprisingly strong, and the banshee moved with otherworldly grace. She slipped into the water, pulling Chloe under. The last thing I saw of my friend was her wide, terrified eyes as the murky depths claimed her. I screamed, plunging my arm into the water, but only felt slime and debris. The banshee and Chloe were gone. The cultists, those still conscious, were fleeing in all directions. Their morale shattered. Overwhelmed by despair and horror, I stumbled away from the stream. My body screamed in protest, but fear and shock drove me on. I don't remember how long I wandered. Eventually, I found an old logging path again. Dawnlight turned the sky a sickly gray. My ears still rang, and I kept hallucinating the sound of Chloe's voice, calling for help. My entire body trembled with cold and terror. By sheer luck, I stumbled upon a logging truck parked on a wider road. The driver, an older man with weathered hands, nearly jumped out of his skin when he saw me, bloodied, filthy, half mad. He took me to the nearest hospital, and that's the last I remember before passing out in the passenger seat. Now, months later, I'm back in Bloomington, trying to piece together a normal life. The local authorities found no sign of Chloe or the cult. The area around Blackwood Lake is vast and treacherous, and I suspect the group simply vanished deeper into the swamp. Officially, Chloe is listed as missing. I've given statements, but the police don't believe my story about the banshee or the masked devotees. They chalk it up to delusion or trauma. Yet, every night, I'm haunted by the memory of Chloe's final scream. Sometimes, in my small apartment, I swear I hear her voice. It calls my name so softly at first, then rising to a mournful wail that makes my skin crawl. Once, I found wet footprints on my floor, leading toward the bedroom. I try to tell myself it's just my broken mind playing tricks, but I can't be sure. What I do know is that there's something in those swamps, something old, filled with rage and sorrow. Something that demands sacrifice. And I know, with a certainty that chills me, that it's not done with me yet. I can't forget, and I can't go back, either. Because if I do, I'm certain I'll join Chloe in the murky depths, forever claimed by her voice in the swamp. My name Alex Ramsey, 31 years old, standing at the edge of nowhere, staring out at the Badlands in North Dakota. Theodore Roosevelt National Park, to be exact. Just saying the name still makes my chest tighten up. I can still smell that weird, earthy decay and see those messed up shadows that didn't make any sense. I swear, this place it does something to you. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. I went out there with my buddy Mike and his girlfriend, Sarah. Mike was always the one chasing the next big thing, you know. He had this YouTube channel, barely any followers, but he was convinced he was going to be famous. He filmed everything. Sarah, she was the opposite, super practical, always prepared. She was the type to double-check the locks and read the safety instructions on airplanes, even though no one ever does. Me. I was kind of obsessed with survival stuff. I'd spent years teaching myself how to track, build shelters, purify water, all that jazz. Part of it was because of my little brother. He died a few years back, hiking accident. Maybe I thought this trip would help me, I don't know, get some closure. So, Mike pitches this idea. We're gonna hike deep into the Badlands, find this hidden cave with ancient petroglyphs, and get some killer footage. I hesitated, I won't lie. The Badlands aren't called bad for nothing. The weather's insane. The terrain is rough, and there's zero cell service. But Mike, he could be persuasive. He talked me into it. Sarah only agreed because she didn't trust us out there alone. She knew Mike took risks, and she probably figured I had my own issues to deal with, which fair enough. We set out early one Monday morning, driving for hours into the park. Our SUV was bouncing all over those rough back roads until we hit the trailhead, just a lonely sign half buried in the dust. The sky was huge, that bright glaring blue, and the buttes and canyons were jutting out everywhere like broken teeth. We had enough gear for a week: tents, food, tons of water, and some cheap backup equipment that Mike swore we wouldn't need. I had a bad feeling from the get-go. The vibe between Mike and Sarah was already tense. She hated that he wanted to film every single step. He hated that she complained about the gear he got on sale. Within an hour, we found out one of the tents had a tier. Sarah just gave me this look, rolled her eyes. I didn't say anything, just tightened my pack and kept walking. The first couple of days, the weather was decent. We stuck to the trails, more or less, scoping out the crazy landscape. Mike kept stopping to film everything: a tumbleweed, a hawk circling, the way the canyons looked in the distance. Sarah was mostly quiet, just letting him do his thing. But I noticed she stayed close to me whenever she could, like she sensed something was off. Then, on the third day, things started getting weird. It was almost sunset, and I was looking for a spot to set up camp when I smelled something full. At first, I thought it was a dead animal or something, but it was way stronger. I followed the smell and found it a deer carcass. But it wasn't just dead, it was wrong. It was stripped to the bone, but twisted, like someone had bent it in ways it shouldn't go. The rib cage was cracked open, and the skull. It looked like it had been turned backward. It made my stomach churn. Sarah refused to go near it. "Alex, we should go back," she said, her voice shaky. "This isn't normal." But Mike, of course, was already filming. "Might just be a predator," he muttered, but even his voice shook a little. He forced a grin and pointed the camera at me. "Tell my viewers what you think, Alex." I just scowled and turned away. It didn't look like any predator kill I'd ever seen. The marks on the bones, the way the limbs were arranged, something was seriously off. But I didn't want to freak them out more, so I just said, "Let's just move on." We set up camp further down the canyon. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind was howling through the rocks, making these eerie sounds. It almost sounded hungry. The next morning, we noticed something was up with our water. I saw Sarah rummaging through her backpack, looking confused. "Did someone move our water?" Her voice tight. I shook my head. "No, it was all under the tarp by the tent." She looked totally exasperated. Mike," she corrected herself, giving him the side eye. "Did you take shrug?" "All innocent. I didn't touch it. Maybe you just misplaced it." "Yeah," Sarah said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Because I love hiding water to mess with myself." It was a small thing, but it was unsettling. Losing supplies out here was a big deal. We decided to conserve what we had left and push on. Mike was convinced we were close to that cave he'd heard about. He had this map he'd printed out from some old hiker's blog, full of warnings about how the coordinates might be wrong, but he swore by it. Sarah just rolled her eyes again. I stayed quiet, scanning the terrain. Every time the wind changed direction, I felt the hairs on my neck stand up. Late that afternoon, we found it, the cave. From the outside, it looked like a jagged gash in the rock face, hidden behind a pile of boulders. We approached it slowly. The smell from before, that rank, decaying smell, was coming from inside, even stronger now. Sarah gagged and covered her mouth. Mike, though, he was lit up. He turned on his camera. "This is it," he whispered, like he was afraid something inside might hear him. "This could be the big one. Petroglyphs. Ancient artifacts, imagine the footage." I wanted to say we should come back in the morning, or maybe just, not go in at all. But Mike was already creeping inside, filming the interior. Sarah stayed at the entrance, shining her flashlight around. As soon as the light hit the cave walls, I saw the markings. Jagged shapes and lines that looked like warnings. And on the ground, bones. Human bones. It took a second for my brain to catch up. A skull, half buried in the dirt, the jaw missing, rib fragments arranged in a circle. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. My stomach did a flip. Sarah backed out of the cave, her eyes wide with terror. Mike stumbled after her, camera shaking in his hand. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice trembling. "This isn't just some random cave. Something terrible happened here." Mike looked torn, like he was fighting between being scared and being excited about the footage. But then we heard Sarah scream, a raw, primal sound that made my blood run cold. We sprinted outside. She was standing a few yards away, staring across the canyon. At first, I didn't see anything, just the wind moving the sparse grass. Then I saw it, a figure, standing on a distant ridge. It was tall and gaunt, with something like antlers curling from its head. Even from that far away, I could feel its eyes on us. A low, guttural growl reached, like an inhuman chuckle. Sarah whimpered, stepping backward. "What is that?" Mike swallowed hard. "Could be a person, wearing a headdress." His voice was shaky, unconvincing. "People don't move like that," I said. It was gone. 1 second it was there on the ridge, the next it vanished, like a puff of smoke. Fear settled in around us, thick and heavy. "Still," Mike insisted we camp a short distance from the cave. "We're exhausted," he said. "We'll leave first thing in the morning." I wanted to argue, but it was already getting dark, and traveling at night in the Badlands could be even more dangerous. That night, I barely slept. I clutched my pocket knife, listening to every sound. Sometime around midnight, I heard footsteps circling our camp. Slow, deliberate steps. They crunched on the gravel, then paused. I tried to wake Mike, but he was either dead asleep or too scared to respond. Sarah stirred and whispered, "Alex, do you hear that?" I nodded, gripping her hand in the darkness. The footsteps resumed, then stopped again. Right on the other side of the tent. Finally silence. Then a single, ragged breath, right next to the thin nylon of the tent. I held my breath, my heart hammering. A shape pressed against the tent wall, and I saw the silhouette of something impossibly thin, leaning in. Then, just like that, it was gone. I strained my ears, but all I heard was the lonely wind. When morning came, our campsite was trashed. One of Mike's cameras was smashed, our radio was bent in half. Sarah's jacket was shredded. The tracks in the dirt made no sense, like hooves, but elongated wrong. Mike was cursing under his breath. Sarah just looked at me, this silent accusation in her eyes, like I should have done something. "Let's go," I said, stating the obvious. "We need to get back to the main trail." Mike checked his phone, still no signal. Sarah rummaged through our supplies. "Great," she muttered, "more water is gone." We had no choice but to hike out fast. We rationed what little water we had left. But navigating those mazes, like canyons, took longer than we thought. By noon, the sun was beating down, and we couldn't find any shade. At some point, we lost the trail. Mike swore we were going the right way, but Sarah accused him of ignoring the map for the sake of his stupid videos. They started arguing, their voices echoing off the rocks. I tried to get between them, to calm them down, but it just made them angrier at me, at each other. The tension was insane. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again, that figure. It was standing at the edge of the canyon, watching us. I tried to shout, but before I could, it melted away behind a crag of stone. By dusk, we were too exhausted to go on. We set up a pathetic excuse for a campsite near a trickle of water that pooled in a rock basin. It wasn't enough to fill our bottles, but it was something. Mike was filming half-heartedly, complaining about the lost footage, the broken camera, you name it. Sarah just glared at him, then wandered off to gather firewood. I busied myself checking our supplies. That's when I noticed something else was missing: my survival knife. I tore through my pack, nothing. I was sure I'd had it that morning. Sarah came back, and I asked if she'd seen it. She shook her head. Mike insisted he hadn't touched it. None of us said it, but we all knew something else had taken it. Night fell, and I couldn't sleep. I stood watch, my mind racing. That unearthly figure, the deer carcass, the bones in the cave. Every hair on my body was on end. I remembered the rancid smell that was on the wind. After hours of tense silence, I drifted off for maybe a moment. When I woke up, it was to Sarah screaming. I jumped up, heart pounding. Sarah was gone from her tent. Mike emerged, flashlight shaking in his hand. We saw footprints leading away, one set of normal footprints, hers and that other set, that elongated hoof-like pattern. We followed them, calling her name. No response. They led us deeper into a narrow canyon, the walls towering above us. The smell of decay got stronger the further we went. And then, we saw it, the cave again. My stomach twisted with dread. We found Sarah inside, tied at the wrists with these twisted vines, half conscious. As I rushed to free her, a low hiss echoed through the chamber. Something moved in the darkness. Mike shone his flashlight wildly. The thing stepped into view. Or at least, what I can only call the thing. It looked like a walking corpse, gaunt and skeletal, with antlers that scraped the cave ceiling. Its eyes glowed faintly, like dying embers. My knees went weak. "Sarah," Mike gasped, lunging toward her. The creature made a guttural sound. It was as if it spoke, but through our own voices. I heard Mike's voice call my name from behind me, but Mike was in front of me. The echo was disorienting, and I nearly dropped to my knees from dizziness. My ears rang, and I felt this icy dread seep into my bones. Sarah let out a whimper of pain as I slashed at the vines with a small blade I'd borrowed from her pack. I glanced back to see the thing inching closer, impossibly slow. That's when I realized Mike had backed away. He was filming. My blood ran cold. "Help me," I snarled, but he just stood there, eyes wide, the camera pointed at us. In that instant, I understood. Something had changed in Mike. His pupils seemed dilated, his face almost hungry. Was it fear, or was it something else? I finally got Sarah free, half carrying her toward the cave entrance. The thing lunged. We dove aside, but it grabbed my leg in a claw-like hand. A searing pain shot up my shin. I kicked frantically and, somehow, by pure luck, broke free. Mike screamed something incoherent, and I saw him take off, vanishing into the darkness outside. Sarah and I scrambled up, sprinting after him. The thing's snarls echoed behind us. My leg throbbed, but adrenaline kept me going. Outside, the night seemed darker than ever. Moonlight illuminated the rocky canyon walls, casting monstrous shadows. Sarah stumbled, still groggy. I supported her weight, calling Mike's name, no answer. We were alone. We managed to get back to our camp, but Mike was gone. He'd taken our GPS, and the only remaining full water bottle. We were left with a single half-empty container and a small stash of energy bars. My mind reeled. Why would Mike do that? Had he snapped, or was something controlling him? Sarah collapsed by the smoldering embers of our campfire. I examined her wrists. They were bruised and raw. She looked at me, tears in her eyes. "He left us," she whispered. I felt panic welling up inside. "We'll find him," I said, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to. Anger warred with fear. If we didn't get out soon, that thing would come back. Maybe it never left. By dawn, Sarah and I started moving again, following what we hoped was the path back to the main trail. My leg was throbbing, swollen, each step sending waves of pain up my body. Sarah kept looking over her shoulder. That feeling of being hunted weighed on us, heavy as a physical burden. It was mid-afternoon when we heard a voice echoing off the canyon walls. Mike's voice, shouting for help. Sarah looked at me, torn. Even after everything, we had to try. We followed the voice around a bend, deeper into a winding gorge. That's where we found him. He was standing on a rocky ledge, beckoning us closer. He looked rough, eyes wild, face smeared with dirt. I limped over, just behind Sarah, my heart pounding. Something wasn't right about the way he grinned. It was too wide, almost triumphant. "Ben, what's going on?" I asked. "But I meant Mike." His name was Mike. He just stared, then said, "Look who finally showed up," in this flat, weird tone. He raised the camera, filming Sarah and me. "The Wendigo said it needs more offerings." Before I could react, he swung a rock at my head. Pain exploded, and the world spun. I hit the ground, vision swimming. I heard Sarah shriek my name. Hands grabbed me, dragged me over the rough terrain. The next thing I knew, I was in darkness again, my wrists and ankles restrained. When I came to, I realized I was back in that cursed cave. My leg was throbbing fiercely, and my head ached. I tried to lift my arms bound. Tried to speak, my mouth was dry as dust. My flashlight lay on the ground a few feet away, flickering. By its weak light, I saw Sarah next to me, also bound. She was conscious, but weak, tears streaking her dusty face. Mike paced around us, breathing heavily. He looked at us with this unsettling mix of guilt and excitement. "It told me if I gave it one sacrifice, we could all leave," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry, but I need that footage. This is my chance to blow up. Don't you get it? This is real. People will pay attention." I tried to speak, but only a croak came out. The Wendigo, that's what he called it, lurked just at the edge of the flashlight beam. I could see the outline of its ribs, the unnaturally long limbs. Its antlers scraped the cave ceiling. A foul smell washed over me. It made a raspy sound, like it was laughing. Mike knelt down, took a knife from his belt, my survival knife. "I just have to give it one of you," he whispered, his eyes darting from me to Sarah. Sarah closed her eyes, tears slipping down her face. I'd never felt so helpless. Rage and terror churned inside me. I looked at Mike, tried one last time to reach him. "This thing will kill all of us," I managed. "It's using you." He shook his head, tears glistening in his eyes, but he raised the knife. As he did, something in the cave's darkness moved. The Wendigo jerked forward with sudden violence, swatting Mike aside like a rag doll. He slammed into the wall, dropping the knife. The creature loomed over him, sniffing, hungry. For a moment, Mike screamed in agony. Then, he went silent. My stomach lurched. Horror overwhelmed me. Sarah turned away, sobbing. I seized the opportunity. The knife lay a few feet away, and the ropes around my wrists were slightly loose. I stretched my fingers, ignoring the pain in my leg, and managed to knock the knife handle closer. With a desperate maneuver, I grabbed it, sawing through my bindings. I freed Sarah just as the Wendigo turned its attention back toward us. We bolted, stumbling over bones and debris. My leg nearly gave out, but adrenaline kept me going. The creature shrieked, a piercing sound that echoed off every surface. Outside, night was falling again. The red-orange glow in the sky gave way to twilight, painting the canyons in shadow. We ran blindly, half carrying each other, until we heard the distant barking of dogs. My heart leaped with hope. Park rangers. I had no idea how they ended up there. Maybe someone saw Mike's earlier footage, or reported missing hikers. We followed the barking, eventually seeing flashlights bobbing in the distance. Sarah and I collapsed near a small group of rangers and search and rescue volunteers. They rushed to help us, calling for medics. I looked back at the looming canyon half, expecting to see the Wendigo step into the light, but there was nothing, not even a sound. I blacked out soon after. I woke up in a hospital bed in Medora, a nearby town. Doctors tended to my leg, a nasty fracture, they said. Sarah had bruised ribs and severe dehydration. Both of us were questioned by the authorities. They seemed skeptical about our claims of a monstrous creature. They chalked up Mike's disappearance to a tragic accident. Search parties never found him, or any cave with human bones. Or maybe they just never reported it. To this day, part of me wonders if the Wendigo let us go on purpose, savoring our terror. I can't shake the memory of its eyes glowing in the dark, or the final moments when it turned on Mike with that predatory glee. People ask me sometimes, "Did you guys have a falling out? Is that why Mike vanished?" I don't have a good answer. All I know is, I can still hear that awful, hungry sound echoing in my nightmares. I'm 31 years old, and I'll never set foot in those canyons again. I've learned that some places are better left alone, and some hungers can never be satisfied. Whether you call it a Wendigo, a demon, or a spirit, it's out there in the Badlands. And I can't shake the feeling that it's still waiting. Waiting for anyone foolish enough to come looking. Anyone who wanders too far from civilization, believing they can conquer the wilderness. If you ever go out there, remember my story. Because once you see those hollow eyes in the dark, you'll never truly escape. My name is Ben Miller. I'm 32, and what I'm about to tell you went down less than a year ago at Spirit Lake in North Dakota. I've replayed that night in my head a million times, trying to tell myself it was just a nightmare, but deep down, I know it wasn't. It all started with my girlfriend, Sarah Jenkins. She was the adventurous type, always chasing the next thrill for her photography. Me, I'm more of a stay-at-home guy, but I went along with it. Our relationship had been on the rocks for months, and I figured a weekend getaway might be just what we needed. Fresh air, quiet nights, a chance to actually talk without all the usual distractions. We rolled into Spirit Lake on a Friday afternoon. The sun was hanging low, turning the water all shimmery gold. I'd rented a little cabin near the shore. It was way off the beaten path, surrounded by these massive pines and a narrow dirt road that looked like it hadn't seen a car in weeks. It was the kind of place that was both romantic and kinda creepy at the same time. The cabin itself was straight out of a movie, creaky floors, wood, paneled walls, and this musty smell that made it clear no one had opened a window in ages. It had a bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room with a fireplace. After we got settled, Sarah grabbed her camera, itching to get some shots of the lake at sunset. I tagged along. There was this old fisherman, Hank, casting off the dock. He gave us a nod but seemed weirdly uneasy when we said we were staying for the weekend. He spat on the ground and muttered, "You two be careful out here. The lake don't take kindly to strangers, especially at night." Sarah gave me this little smirk like it was some kind of joke, but I felt a bead of sweat roll down my back. There was something in Hank's eyes that told me he wasn't messing around. As it got dark, we lit a fire in the fireplace and crashed on the old couch. Sarah was going through her photos, and I was just staring into the flames, trying not to think about what Hunk had said. She showed me a couple of shots of the shoreline and the woods. One of them made my stomach flip. There was this figure in the distance, a silhouette that looked like a woman standing at the water's edge. Sarah said it was just a trick of the light, maybe a branch or something. I wasn't convinced. Later that night, I woke up to this soft tapping on the cabin window. 3 taps, then nothing. I sat up, heart hammering, but the room was pitch black. The only sound was Sarah breathing beside me. I tried to tell myself I'd imagined it, but as I was drifting off again, there it was, another series of knocks, slower, more on purpose this time. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it on the window. Nothing. No footprints, no shadows, just darkness. In the morning, I noticed these fresh scratches on the cabin door. They looked like claw marks, 3 parallel lines, raw and deep. Probably just raccoons, Sarah said, brushing it off. She seemed more worried about her camera acting up. A bunch of photos from the night before were messed up, all static and blurs. But one photo did show that silhouette again, only this time it was closer. You could almost make out a pale face. It made the hairs on my arms stand up. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously off about this place. It seemed like every time I tried to forget about it, something else would happen to remind me that we weren't alone out there. By midday, Sarah was all about kayaking. She'd read somewhere that Spirit Lake had these killer views, especially around sunset. I was still feeling uneasy, remembering old Hunk's warning, but Sarah was so pumped about it, it was hard to say no. So, we hauled these 2 rented kayaks down to the shoreline. The water was calm, like glass, under the afternoon sun, and for a while, it actually felt like a normal, romantic getaway. We paddled around, checking out the scenery. Even managed to laugh a little about how we'd been letting stupid arguments get between us. We got back to the cabin late in the afternoon, and guess who showed up? Hank. He came by to check on us, he said. He peered at Sarah's camera, and his face went all serious when he saw that weird silhouette photo. "That's her," he mumbled, shaking his head. "Who?" I asked, already dreading the answer. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Willow. Some folks call her the Hag of Spirit Lake. It's an old story. They say she drowned her husband and his bit on the side out on this lake, then killed herself. Now she haunts the shores, looking for couples to drag under. You two best not go out after dark." Sarah tried to laugh it off after Hank left, but I could see the doubt creeping into her eyes. We both felt it, the weight of the story, the feeling that maybe this lake wasn't just any lake. As night started to fall, Sarah got restless. She was all about going back out on the lake under the full moon to get some dramatic shots. I was like, no way, at first, but she kept pushing, saying I was being paranoid. Honestly, I was tired of fighting, especially when things were so tense between us already. So, yeah, I caved. The lake at night was something else. It was beautiful, in a haunting kind of way. A light fog was rolling in, and the sky was clear, except for a few wispy clouds. Sarah was snapping away, totally lost in the eerie glow. Every stroke of my paddle felt like I was moving through molasses, like the lake itself was pushing back. And then I heard it, this crying, faint and muffled, echoing across the water. Sarah heard it too, her head whipping around, trying to find where it was coming from. There, on the shoreline, was a dark figure, its face turned towards us. At first, I thought it was Hank, but the way it was standing was just wrong. Its arms were hanging limp, and its head was tilted at this crazy angle. The crying got louder, echoing across the lake. Suddenly, Sarah screamed, her kayak rocked violently. I spun towards her, shining my flashlight, just in time to see this pale hand gripping the side of her kayak, pulling her down. Her scream cut through the air as she disappeared under the water. I didn't even think, I just plunged in after her. The water was like ice, and the darkness swallowed me whole. I was searching blind, thrashing around, when I felt something brush against my leg. Then I saw it, a face, sunken eyes, leathery skin, hair floating around like seaweed. It was the thing from the photos, from the legend. But before I could react, it was gone again, and I managed to grab Sarah's arm and yank her back up. We scrambled onto the kayaks, gasping for air. Sarah was shaking, her eyes were wide and unfocused. She coughed up water, stammering about how she felt hands trying to pull her down. My heart was hammering so hard, I thought I was going to pass out. We paddled back to the cabin like our lives depended on it, which, you know, they probably did. The figure was gone from the shore. The second we stumbled inside the cabin, Sarah started acting different. She was freezing cold to the touch, and her eyes had this distant, glazed over look. She wouldn't talk to me, wouldn't even look at me, except for these weird mutters that didn't sound like her at all. I lit a fire, trying to warm her up, but she wouldn't go near it. She just huddled in the corner, hugging her knees, whispering, "Ben, you betrayed me," over and over. I tried to comfort her, but her eyes were wild, almost hateful. She started going on about my ex-girlfriend, accusing me of still being in love with her. The whole thing was bizarre and totally out of left field. Sarah had never even met her and didn't know a thing about her. But Sarah, or whatever was controlling her, was acting like she knew all these details I'd never told anyone. That's when it hit me. This wasn't Sarah talking. Not really. Or, at least, not just Sarah. It was like something had taken over her, and it was using her to get to me. Then, out of nowhere, Hank showed up at the door, looking like he'd seen a ghost. He said he'd heard the screaming from across the lake. One look at Sarah, and his face went pale. "She's got Willow in her," he said, his voice low and shaky. "This is just what happened to my Mary. I tried to warn her, but she went out on that lake at night and..." He trailed off, his eyes filled with this awful sadness. "If we don't do something, she'll die. And you will too, that's Willow's way." Before I could even process what he was saying, Sarah lunged at me. She was crazy strong, like she was fueled by some kind of rage. She knocked me over, and I hit my head on the stone hearth. Everything went black for a second. When I came to, I was tied to a wooden chair, ropes digging into my wrists and ankles. Sarah, or whatever was controlling her, was standing over me, her face twisted into this cruel grin. Hank was lying unconscious near the door, blood trickling from his temple. Sarah started whispering in that hollow, echoing voice. "He betrayed me, just like you. You'll drown for what you did. We'll all drown." My stomach dropped to my feet as I realized what she was planning. She wanted to reenact Willow's final act, drowning the man she thought had wronged her. Only this time, that man was me. She grabbed my hair and yanked my head back, hissing, "You'll feel the water fill your lungs." I tried to plead with her, to reach the real Sarah, hoping she was still in there somewhere. Her eyes flickered for a second, like she recognized me, but then that hateful glare returned. Hank started to stir. He mumbled something I couldn't understand, then he saw us. "Listen to me," he groaned, forcing himself up. "This isn't you, Sarah. You gotta fight it." Sarah laughed, this mocking, eerie sound. She backhanded Hank, sending him crashing into the wall. I shouted at her to stop, my voice cracking. She just sneered and started dragging me towards the door, chair and all. The ropes were biting into my skin as she pulled me out onto the porch, heading for the lake. My bare feet scraped against the dirt, and I could hear Hank stumbling behind us, trying to follow. We were almost at the water's edge, And I knew this was it. This was how I was going to die. I was going to drown in that cursed lake, just like in the stories. And the worst part was, the woman I loved was going to be the one to do it. But something in me, some basic survival instinct, just wouldn't let me give up. I had to find a way out for both of us. The moon was still bright, lighting up the water's surface in a silvery sheen. Emily yanked me to the shore, her breath ragged, her eyes blazing with a fury that wasn't her own. I could taste the metallic tang of fear on my tongue. Hank somehow managed to tackle Emily from behind, loosening her grip on me. The impact knocked us all to the ground. I toppled sideways, and the chair splintered on the rocks, freeing one of my arms. Pain shot through my shoulder, but I kept pulling at the ropes, fueled by adrenaline. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Emily lash out, striking Hank's head against a large stone. He let out a guttural moan and collapsed. Without hesitating, Emily seized my broken chair, determined to drag me the rest of the way. I felt hot tears of frustration well up. I didn't want to hurt her, but my survival instincts kicked in. I jerked my free arm, grabbing her wrist. "Emily," I shouted. "Listen to me." Her expression wavered for an instant. I sensed a flicker of the woman I knew inside those haunted eyes. Taking advantage of the hesitation, I shoved her away with all my strength. She sprawled onto the wet sand. I managed to untangle the remaining ropes, my thoughts jumbled, adrenaline still surging. I rushed to Hank's side. Blood matted his hair, and his breathing was shallow. "Emily, no." Willow climbed to her feet, a grim, otherworldly determination twisting her features. She charged at me. I braced myself, but Hank suddenly staggered in front of her, arms outstretched. He turned to me and rasped, "Run." Then he turned back to face Emily, his eyes fierce with resolve. She lunged, and they both tumbled into the lake. The water churned, foam splashing under the moonlight. I could just make out Hank's face, contorted in pain. Then he was gone. So was she. For a few horrible seconds, everything was silent. I gasped, trying to catch my breath, scanning the lake. A faint bubble rose to the surface, and then all was still. Trembling, I stepped backward, half expecting Emily to emerge, to lunge at me again. But the ripples vanished, leaving the water calm. It was as though the lake had swallowed them whole, erasing any evidence of the struggle. My legs gave out, and I sank to the shore, tears burning my eyes. Part of me wanted to dive back in, to save Hank, to save Emily. But I knew that if I went back into that dark water, I wouldn't come out. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. And then the slow, awful realization hit me: my Emily might be gone forever. Suddenly, a quiet splashing caught my attention. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding. A dark figure emerged from the lake, stumbling onto the shore. It was Emily. She was coughing up water, disoriented, her movements weak. Without a second thought, I rushed to her. I half expected her to attack again, but she collapsed into my arms, trembling. Her eyes were wide with terror. She whispered my name, and this time, it was truly her voice. I helped her away from the water, glancing back for any sign of Hank or Willow. The lake was silent once more. Emily wept, her body shaking violently, and I held her close, tears streaming down my cheeks as well. She could barely speak, but she managed to say, "Hank, he saved me." I nodded, overcome by guilt and grief for a man I'd only just met. We staggered back to the cabin, supporting each other. I locked the door and lit the fireplace. The warmth felt impossible to find. Emily changed into dry clothes, her eyes unfocused, as if trying to process the horrors she'd experienced. I wanted to call for help, but there was no cell reception out here, and my phone was dead from the water. We stayed up the rest of the night, silent except for the crackle of the fire. At dawn, we left. We didn't bother taking anything but our wallets and keys. We drove away from Spirit Lake, not once looking in the rearview mirror. A week passed before Emily would talk about what happened. She claimed she remembered very little, only flashes of choking water and voices that weren't hers. She said she felt like she was in a dream, forced to watch someone else control her actions, twist her thoughts. Whenever I tried to bring up Hunk, her expression would crumble, and she'd break down. In the weeks and months that followed, Emily became a shadow of her former self. Nightmares plagued her, and sometimes she'd wake in a cold sweat, insisting she still felt Willow's presence. There were nights I'd find her staring out the window, softly whispering apologies to someone who wasn't there. As for me, I can't close my eyes without seeing Hunk's face, the moment he sacrificed himself to save us. I think about how unfair it all was, how I should have listened to his warning from the start. Maybe none of this would have happened if I'd insisted we leave the moment we arrived. Maybe we could have avoided crossing paths with the cursed spirit of that lake. We never found Hunk's body, and no one believed us when we told them what happened. They chalked it up to panic, an accident, or a storm that swept him away. Police divers never recovered anything. It was as if he'd simply vanished into thin air. Emily and I tried to stay together after that, but our bond was forever damaged by the terror we endured. She left one day without saying goodbye, leaving only a note. "I'm sorry, Ben. I can't fight it anymore. I've searched for her, called her phone, contacted her family. No one knows where she went. Sometimes I lie awake, convinced that if I drove back to Spirit Lake, I'd find her standing at the shore, waiting. I haven't set foot in North Dakota since. Friends ask why I avoid anything to do with lakes or large bodies of water, and I just say I have my reasons. I'm 32 years old, and I carry memories that make me feel ancient. The nightmares remain, and sometimes, late at night, I hear that same faint knock on my window, a reminder that maybe Willow, or whatever darkness lurks in that lake, isn't finished with me yet. So, that's my story. I wish it were just a bad dream, or a wild tale for a campfire, but I lived every second of it. And I lost two people I cared about in the process: Hank, the brave old man who gave everything, and Emily, the love of my life, who slipped away from me in a way I still don't fully understand. If you ever find yourself at Spirit Lake, and someone warns you to stay away after dark, please, for your own sake, listen to them. Because once Willow chooses you, there may be no going back. My name's Mark Reynolds. I'm 42, ex-army medic, seen some stuff, you know. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepped me for what happened to my family in that damn forest. It was supposed to be a chill family camping trip, a way to unplug and get away from all the crap we'd been dealing with. Money was tight. My wife, Sarah, and I were at each other's throats, and our teenage daughter, Emma, was in full-on rebel mode. Only one who was actually stoked about roughing it was our year-old little Ben. He was buzzing about seeing squirrels and chipmunks. Sarah, who's 40, wanted a proper vacation, a hotel, a pool, the whole 9 yards. She works as a nurse, and a tough one. She's not the biggest fan of roughing it. But I was dead set on camping. I pictured us roasting marshmallows, telling stories around the campfire, you know, bonding. "Don't worry, babe," I told her, packing up our beat-up old SUV. "I've got this. I know what I'm doing." Famous last words, right? Sarah gave me that look, the one that says, "I highly doubt it, but I'll let you have this." Emma, 17, just rolled her eyes, glued to her phone like always, blasting some angsty music through her headphones. Ben, on the other hand, was practically bouncing off the walls, asking if we'd see bears and wolves. I told him maybe not bears, but definitely some cool critters. We got to Blackwood National Forest that Tuesday, mid-June. Place was gorgeous, I'll give it that. Towering pines, trails wending through the trees, like something out of a postcard. We decided to set up camp off the main trail, a little deeper in. Figured it'd be quieter, more secluded. Hindsight's 2020, they say. That was my first big screw up. That first night, we're huddled around the campfire, and this howl, like nothing I'd ever heard, cuts through the darkness. Emma, being Emma, starts teasing Ben, saying it's a werewolf hungry for little brothers. But this howl, it was weird. It almost sounded human. Ben clutched my arm, looking terrified. I told him it was probably just coyotes. Sarah shot me this look, worried, but I shrugged it off. Just animals, I said. Nothing to worry about. But morning came and things seemed better. We made pancakes on our little portable stove, and even Emma cracked a smile. A real one, not a usual sarcastic smirk. Then we found those prints, big ones, near our campsite in the soft dirt. They looked like paw prints, but stretched out, like whatever made them had claws way longer than any dog or coyote I'd ever seen. Sarah gave me that "let's get the hell out of here" look. But me being stubborn, I said, "It's fine. Probably just some injured animal limping around." I suggested we explore deeper in the woods, then loop back to the main trails. I figured we'd be out by the weekend, no problem. We broke camp and headed further in. The air felt heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. Midday Emma wandered off taking pictures of some stupid flower near a creek, and she found a deer carcass. Not just dead, but mangled, half-eaten, and still pretty fresh. She let out this blood-curdling scream that brought us running. When I saw that thing, its ribs all stripped clean, I felt a shiver go down my spine. Whatever did that was savage, and it had been there recently. Ben looked like he was going to throw up, and Sarah was practically begging me to turn back. But no, not me. "We'll just go a little further," I said. "Then we'll head back to the car tomorrow." Truth was, I was starting to feel a little lost. Our GPS, the fancy one I'd insisted on buying, was on the fritz. Every time I tried to get a reading, it just reset. I was left with my paper map and compass, feeling like an idiot. That's when we bumped into him. So, there we were in the middle of nowhere. Sarah's freaking out, Ben's pale as a sheet, and Emma's gone back to being sullen and silent after the deer incident. And who do we stumble upon? A park ranger. Tall, lean guy, dressed in the standard issue uniform. He introduced himself as Ranger Hayes. Said he was patrolling the deeper parts of the forest because of some unusual activity lately. He wouldn't say what kind of activity though, just gave us this cryptic look. Now I asked him if he could point us back to a main trail. He said yeah, but something about him felt off. His eyes were bloodshot, and he kept pausing, like he was choosing his words very carefully. Still, having a ranger around, even a weird one, gave me a sense of relief, a false sense of relief as it turned out. We made camp together that night. Sarah was still on edge, but Ben seemed to calm down a little, fascinated by Ranger Hayes' stories about the forest. During dinner, Hayes started talking about local legends, specifically about this creature called the Wendigo. Said it was some kind of evil spirit that lived in the woods, preying on lost travelers. "It'll mess with your head," Hayes said, his voice low, stirring the fire with a stick. "Make you turn on each other. Brings out your deepest, darkest hungers." Emma snorted, popping a marshmallow in her mouth. "Right, so it's a campfire story. Got it." Hayes' eyes flicked up to meet hers. "It's more than a story," he said quietly. "I've seen things out here, signs. Broken antlers, animals ripped apart in ways that, well, it makes you wonder what's out there. Something's driving the predators mad." I felt Sarah's hand grip mine under the table. I gave her a squeeze, trying to reassure her, but inside, I was cursing myself for dragging us out here. I was supposed to be the tough, ex-military guy, protecting my family, And here I was, leading them into God knows what. But I couldn't show fear. Not in front of them. Later that night, close to midnight, I woke up needing to take a leak. As I slipped out of the tent, I saw Hayes crouched by the dying embers of the fire. He was whispering, almost chanting, to the darkness. At first, I couldn't make out the words, but then I heard him say, "Blood for blood, keep it away, must feed, keep it away." A chill ran down my spine, colder than the night air. I ducked back into the tent, my heart hammering against my ribs. What the hell was that all about? Was this guy for real with the Wendigo stuff? Or was he just messing with us? Or was he something else entirely? The next morning, we found that our portable stove was cracked, completely busted. Could have been a cheap piece of junk, could have been an animal, or maybe someone messed with it on purpose. We were running low on food that didn't need cooking, but Hayes assured us we'd reach a main trail by noon. I decided to trust him. Biggest mistake of my life. We walked for hours. Branches whipped at our faces. The green of the forest seemed to press in on us, suffocating. Hayes led the way, consulting his own map. But every now and then, I'd catch him looking at me, a strange expression on his face. It was like pity, mixed with something else. Something that looked a lot like hunger. My gut was screaming at me to get us out of there, but I kept pushing it down. I had to be strong, for Sarah, for Ben, for Emma. And then Emma snapped. We got into this huge fight, right there in the middle of the woods. She started yelling about how she hated camping, hated being dragged out into the middle of nowhere. "I'm not some stupid soldier you can order around, Dad," she screamed, throwing her backpack to the ground. Before I could say anything, she stormed off into the trees. I yelled, but she didn't stop. I told Sarah and Ben to stay put while I went after her, but the forest just swallowed her up. 1 minute she was there, the next gone. Panic seized me. I shouted her name until my throat was raw. But there was no answer. I searched everywhere, pushing through thick undergrowth, tripping over roots, but there was no sign of her. Eventually, I had to go back. I found Sarah and Ben huddled together, tears streaming down their faces. Hayes was leaning against a tree, arms crossed, watching me with that same blank, unsettling stare. "We need to spread out," I said, my voice shaking. "We'll find her, or we'll go back to the car and call for help." Hayes shook his head. "Phone service is spotty out here. Best we can do is head to a ranger station a few miles from here," he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "But it's getting dark. Sarah lost it. I don't care if it's dark. We're not staying out here while our daughter is missing." She turned and started packing up her gear, her hands trembling. "Fine," Hayes said, his voice flat. "I'll lead the way." We walked in silence as the last of the daylight faded, and that's when we started hearing Emma's voice. "Dad, Mom, help me." It sounded distant, coming from somewhere off to our left. We all stopped, our hearts pounding. We called back to her, but Hayes grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Don't follow that," he growled. "Mimicry. The Wendigo can imitate voices. It'll lure you deeper." That was the moment it hit me. He really believed it. Whether the Wendigo was real or not, Ranger Hayes was convinced there was something out there, hunting us. And if he was right, that meant my daughter was out there, alone, with that thing. Darkness fell fast, like a curtain dropping on the worst play ever. We were stumbling through the woods, going in circles. It felt like my compass was spinning uselessly, and the forest had gone deathly silent. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our own ragged breathing. Ben was holding onto Sarah so tight, I thought he'd cut off her circulation. She was trying to be strong for him, but I could see the terror in her eyes. My own heart was hammering so loud I could barely think. We were lost, completely and utterly lost. We decided to set up a makeshift camp just to get our bearings. I sank to the ground, exhausted, every muscle screaming in protest. I kept scanning the shadows, praying for some sign of Emma. That's when Hayes made his move. 1 second I was looking at the trees, the next I saw a flash of metal. Before I could even react, he was on Sarah, yanking her back by her hair. She screamed, a raw animal sound that cut through me like a knife. "Dad!" Ben yelled, his voice high, pitched with fear. I lunged at Hayes, tackling him to the ground. The knife, a hunting knife, I realized, skittered away into the dirt. Hayes was strong, way stronger than he looked. He twisted and bucked, throwing me off him. He slammed me onto my back, knocking the wind out of me. "Don't you see?" he hissed, his face contorted, inches from mine. "We have to appease it. Blood for blood." I struggled against him, my military training kicking in, rusty as it was. I managed to get a grip on his arm, twisting it until I heard a sickening crack. He howled in pain, but he didn't let up. He scrambled up and kicked me in the side, right where my ribs were already bruised. I doubled over, gasping for air, tasting blood. He dove for the knife again. But then, out of nowhere, Sarah was on him. She'd grabbed another, larger hunting knife from our gear, her face pale but determined. She slashed at Hayes, catching him across the shoulder. He shrieked, stumbling back into the ferns. But even wounded, he was like a rabid animal. Hayes was moving with a desperate frenzy now, chanting those same words. "Sacrifices. Keep it away." He was completely gone, lost in some insane delusion. And then, he lunged for Ben. Before I could even think, he had Ben in a headlock, pressing the tip of his blade to my son's throat. My blood turned to ice. I froze, every muscle locked, my mind a blank screen of horror. "Hayes," I screamed, my voice raw. "It doesn't have to be like this." His eyes were glassy, unseeing. "Yes," he rasped. "I've seen what happens if it's not fed. I won't let it take me." I inched closer, my hands up, palms open, trying to reason with a madman. Adrenaline was roaring in my ears, drowning out everything but the sound of Ben's terrified whimpers. Sarah was behind Hayes, her knife raised, but she was shaking so badly I was afraid she'd hit Ben by accident. The forest was so quiet. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, Ben's heartbeat hammering against his chest. Then, in a choked voice, Ben cried, "Dad," as Hayes jerked the knife, slicing a thin, red line across my boy's neck. It wasn't deep, thank God, just a scratch, but the sight of my son's blood. It snapped something inside me. I roared and lunged forward, ignoring the searing pain in my side. I grabbed Hayes' wrist, forcing the blade away from Ben. Sarah leaped forward, plunging her knife into Hayes' side. He let out a strangled gasp, his grip loosening, and Ben scrambled free, tears streaming down his face. Hayes collapsed to the ground, blood spreading across his uniform. I knelt beside him, pressing 2 fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse. "Nothing." "Ease," Sarah whispered, backing away, her face ashen. I nodded, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "He's gone. I'd killed a man. Sure, it was self-defense, defense of my family, but still, I'd taken a life. I'd been trained to save lives, and here I was." For a moment, the only sound was the rustling of leaves and our own frantic breathing. Then, an unearthly wail ripped through the silence. It was high-pitched, keening, like the cry of some tortured animal, and it made my hair stand on end. We all looked up, our eyes wide with terror. My mind tried to rationalize it, to tell me it was just an animal, or the wind. But deep down, I knew. Sarah grabbed Ben, pulling him close. "We have to find Emma," she said, her voice trembling but firm. I nodded, staggering to my feet. My side was throbbing, and I could feel blood soaking through my shirt, but I ignored it. We had to find our daughter. We stumbled onward, into the darkness, guided only by the faint light of the moon. The The temperature seemed to drop with every step, and each breath felt like ice in my lungs. More than once, I thought I heard footsteps behind us, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Just the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. Then the trees opened up into a small clearing. In the center was a cluster of rocks and upturned earth, like something had been digging there. At first, I thought it was a grave. But then, I saw it. Emma's backpack. It was lying on top of the disturbed earth, slashed open, stained with dark, dried blood. My stomach lurched. "Emma," I shouted, my voice echoing through the silent clearing. No answer. We spread out, searching frantically around the clearing, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. Massive, misshapen footprints leading away from the clearing into an even darker part of the forest. They were just like the ones we'd seen before, only bigger, much bigger. "Stay here," I told Sarah and Ben, my voice hoarse. "I'm going after her." I started to follow the prints, each step heavier than the last, my heart pounding so hard I could barely think. And then I saw it. Standing at the edge of the trees, so tall it seemed to blend in with the darkness, was a figure. Gaunt, impossibly tall, with eyes that glowed like embers in the faint moonlight. I saw twisted antlers, impossibly large, protruding from its head, and long, skeletal arms that ended in clawed fingers. It opened its mouth, and that same unearthly wail filled the night air again, a sound of pure hunger and rage. The Wendigo. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a gnarled tree root. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get the hell out of there, but my legs felt like lead. The creature, the Wendigo, if that's what it really was, stood there, at the edge of the trees, its ragged breath wheezing in its throat. It was like something out of a nightmare, a twisted mockery of a human form. Sarah and Ben must have heard the creature's wail, because they came running towards me, their faces white with terror. "Get back," I roared, motioning them away. "Get out of here." But the Wendigo was already moving, lurching forward with a speed that defied its size. It was coming for us, its claws outstretched, its glowing eyes fixed on us with predatory hunger. I grabbed a broken branch from the ground, thick and heavy, brandishing it like a club. It was a pathetic weapon against that thing, but it was all I had. My eyes darted around, searching for any kind of advantage. We were close to a ravine, I realized. I could see the slope dropping off sharply to my left in the dim moonlight. In the chaos, I heard Ben crying out for Emma, and Sarah screaming at me not to do anything foolish. But I already had a plan, a crazy, desperate plan. "Get out of here," I yelled at Sarah and Ben. "Find help now." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Nate, no," she pleaded. "Go," I roared, my voice cracking. She hesitated for a moment, then grabbed Ben's hand, tears streaming down her face, and they vanished into the shadows. The Wendigo lunged at me, its claws raking the air inches from my face. I tossed a flare I always carried, forcing the creature back with a screech of pain as the red light burned its eyes. I had seconds. I sprinted towards the ravine's edge, my lungs burning, my vision blurring from the pain in my side. But I pushed on, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate hope that I could somehow save my family. The creature was right behind me. I could hear its ragged breathing, feel its claws tearing at my shoulder, ripping through my shirt and leaving 3 deep gashes. I nearly collapsed, but I forced myself to stay upright. Another few feet, and I was at the top of the ravine. I spun around, swinging my makeshift club with all my might. The blow connected with the Wendigo's ribs, and I heard a sickening crunch. It shrieked, a sound of pure agony, but it didn't stop. I dropped low, using my own momentum to slam into its legs, trying to knock it off balance. We both went tumbling over the edge, a flailing tangle of limbs. The world became a blur of earth and sky as we crashed down the slope. Branches and rocks battered me from every angle. My head slammed against something hard, and a dizzying blackness threatened to consume me. I felt the Wendigo's bony frame wrench away from me at some point. My last coherent thought was of Sarah, Ben, and Emma, praying that they would make it out of that cursed forest alive. When I came to, the first rays of dawn were filtering through the trees. My entire body was a symphony of pain. I was lying half buried in leaves at the bottom of the ravine, bruised, battered, and bleeding. The Wendigo was gone. No tracks, no blood, nothing. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, if it had all been some kind of fever dream. But then I felt the stinging gashes on my shoulder, saw the torn earth from our fall. I crawled out of the ravine, using nearby rocks for support, and stumbled through the forest in a daze. After what felt like an eternity, I heard voices, park rangers, real ones this time. They found me delirious and near hypothermic. Sarah and Ben were with them, both sobbing uncontrollably when they saw me. I collapsed at their feet, unconsciousness claiming me once more. Later, they told me that a search party had been out all night after Sarah and Ben managed to reach the ranger station. The authorities questioned me, but I could barely speak, consumed by a fever that raged for days. When I finally regained consciousness in the hospital, I learned the truth, the awful truth. They had found Emma's body about a mile from our final campsite. It was partially devoured. The authorities called it an animal attack, maybe a bear or a pack of coyotes. They said they also found the body of a man in a blood-stained ranger uniform, identified as Robert Hayes. They offered no explanation for what he was doing out there, or why he attacked us. Sarah and Ben were physically unharmed, but the emotional scars, those would never fade. I'd lost my daughter, failed to protect her from the horrors lurking in those woods. Even now, months later, whenever I close my eyes, I see that creature, its sunken eyes, its twisted antlers. And I hear the echo of Emma's voice in the forest. Sometimes, I wonder if the Wendigo followed us home, if it left some part of itself inside me. The nightmares, the fleeting shadows in the corners of my vision, they make me question my own sanity. Part of me believes I'll never truly leave Blackwood National Forest behind. That's my story. I swear to you, it's the truth. A father's stubborn pride led us into that cursed forest. We faced betrayal, madness, and a hunger not of this world. I killed a man, lost a daughter, and nearly lost my own life. And even now, in the quiet hours before dawn, I still hear the Wendigo's wail in my dreams, calling me back to the endless shadows beneath those trees. My name is Sarah Jenkins, I'm 29, and I'm about to tell you about something that happened last October in Blackwood State Forest, Oregon. My boyfriend Mark, who just turned 32, somehow talked me into taking a break from our crazy city lives. He'd found this cabin online, supposedly charming, totally off the grid, in the middle of nowhere. Looking back, agreeing to go was the biggest mistake of my life. We got there on one of those perfect fall afternoons. You know the kind, leaves turning all bright orange and yellow, a little bit of mist hanging in the air. Mark was practically skipping around, whistling some tune I didn't recognize, as he hauled our stuff out of the trunk. We'd packed light, just some cheap flashlights we picked up last minute, a first aid kit that was probably half empty, a bunch of those freeze-dried meals that taste like cardboard, and our sleeping bags. Mark kept saying we needed it to rough it, for a more authentic experience. I'm usually the planner, the cautious one, but I was so stressed from my job, from the city, from, well, everything. I just wanted some peace and quiet with Mark. Maybe even find that spark we used to have. The cabin was small, really rustic, no electricity, no running water. Just a wood, burning stove and an old gas lantern that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The windows were dusty, and that front door creaked like something out of a horror movie every time we opened it. The first thing I noticed were these weird carvings on the doorframe. They looked like symbols, all circles intersecting with triangles. I pointed them out to Mark, but he just shrugged. "Probably from the people who stayed here before," he said, already dropping our backpacks onto the creaky floorboards. That first afternoon and evening, things were normal enough. We hiked a short trail, gathered some firewood. Mark kept making jokes about being on one of those survival shows. We struggled to get that old gas lantern working, but we eventually gave up and made a small fire in the cabin's fireplace. I remember how quiet it was. Almost too quiet, like the forest was holding its breath or something. But it was peaceful. We ate our freeze-dried stew, which wasn't half bad, and for a minute, it was actually nice. Just the two of us, no phones, no emails, no deadlines. But that first night, everything started to change. Around midnight, I was drifting off in my sleeping bag when I heard it, a soft, kind of melodic humming. It sounded like it was coming from the woods all around the cabin. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it had a pattern, almost like a lullaby. I nudged Mark. "Hey, do you hear that?" He just grunted, opened his eyes for a second, and mumbled, "Probably just the wind in the trees," then rolled over and shut his eyes again. He didn't seem worried, so I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the wind. Morning came with a light drizzle. We ate some instant oatmeal and decided to explore a bit. On a tree near the cabin, I saw more of those strange carvings. These were more intricate, like letters from some alphabet I'd never seen. They gave me the creeps, but Mark still wasn't bothered. "Just some teenagers messing around," he said. But as we walked deeper into the forest, there were more trees with these symbols, curved lines, spirals, things that looked like runes. And they looked old, like they'd been there for years. The drizzle turned into a steady rain, and the path was getting slippery. By late afternoon, it was a full-on downpour. We were soaked muddy. And we realized we were running low on dry firewood because Mark had insisted we only bring a small bundle from the car. We went back to the cabin, hung our wet clothes by the fireplace, and tried to warm up. The gas lantern was barely flickering in the corner, and I started to feel a knot in my stomach. Everything felt more ominous now that we were cold and wet. That night, the humming came back, only louder. It seemed to weave through the trees, and this time, it was mixed with what sounded like footsteps on the wet leaves outside. I sat up, my heart pounding, and shook Mark awake. He listened, his face looking serious for once. "Could be some local kids messing with us," he said, but even he didn't sound like he believed it. He grabbed one of our cheap flashlights and went to the window. When he shone it outside, the beam was so weak it barely lit up anything, just a few tree trunks and the swirling fog. We hardly slept that night, and when we woke up to a grey, foggy morning, I was exhausted, and Mark was on edge. And for once, he didn't just brush off my concerns. We went outside to look for any signs of who or what had been out there. That's when we saw them. Fresh footprints in the mud around the cabin. Bare footprints, adult-sized, circling the whole place. Whoever it was had walked right up to the windows, even pressed a hand against the glass. There was a muddy handprint on one of the panes. "Okay, I'll admit that's weird," Mark said, his voice tight. "Maybe we should drive into town, let the ranger station know." We got into Mark's old SUV, and he turned the key. The engine sputtered a couple of times, but it wouldn't start. He tried again and again, swearing under his breath, until the battery was dead. We had zero cell service to call for help. We were way too far from the main road for anyone to hear us. And for the first time, I saw real panic in Mark's eyes. We spent the rest of that morning gathering any scrap of wood we could find that wasn't completely soaked. The rain had finally stopped, but everything was still damp. I managed to get a small fire going in the stove while Mark, looking completely lost, tried to tinker with the car's engine. He's no mechanic, and it was clear he had no idea what he was doing. As the sun started to set, this low chanting began to echo through the forest. It wasn't just humming this time, it was like multiple voices, all murmuring in unison. I caught Mark's eye across the dim cabin. "What do we do?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Stay calm," he whispered. "Stay inside." But Mark couldn't stick to his own advice. After about an hour of that creepy chanting, he snapped. He grabbed the flashlight and stomped outside, yelling, "Who's out there?" I wanted to stop him, but I was frozen with fear. I watched through the window as he disappeared around the corner of the cabin. The chanting faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves. Then, silence. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Mark didn't come back. My mind was racing, picturing all kinds of horrible things. Every few minutes, I'd open the door and call his name, but only my own voice echoed back. Desperate, I lit a second candle and went onto the porch. The flashlight he'd taken was nowhere in sight. Just when I was about to go look for him, I heard footsteps crunching in the mud. Mark stumbled into view, panting. His shirt was torn, his arms were covered in scratches, and his eyes looked wild. "Sarah," I saw something, I saw her. My entire body went cold. "Who?" He collapsed onto a chair. "Some woman, long hair, filthy." She was humming, and when I got close, she stopped. Then she whispered my name. "Sarah." My name. He was shaking his head. I asked what she wanted, and she pointed into the woods. Everything went black for a second, and then she was gone. He wouldn't say anything else. He just stared at the floor, shivering. I helped him inside, cleaned his scratches with what little was left in our first aid kit, and tried to get him to drink some water. The night dragged on. We didn't sleep, not even for a minute. The next morning, the air in the cabin felt thick, suffocating. A heavy fog had rolled in, and I couldn't see more than a few feet out the windows. Mark started pacing, muttering to himself. He had this strange look in his eyes, like he was somewhere else. He'd glance at me, then quickly look away, like he was scared of me. "Are you okay?" I asked carefully. He just shook his head. "I can't stop hearing her voice," he whispered. "Like it's in my head." I tried to reason with him. "It's just the fear," I said. "We're stuck, it's stressful. Let's just work together and find a way out." He suddenly pointed at me, his eyes narrowing. "You're the reason we're stuck," he accused. "You made me come out here. You said you wanted a break from the city." My jaw dropped. "Mark, this was your idea." He rubbed his temples. "Shut up, just shut up. I need to think." I stepped back, a knot forming in my stomach. Mark had never spoken to me like that. He looked almost feral, paranoid. Something was very, very wrong. As the day went on, I realized we were down to our last few packets of food. We could still get water from a nearby stream, but it needed to be boiled, and our firewood supply was dangerously low. The tension between us was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Every time I tried to talk to Mark, he'd snap at me, accusing me of plotting against him. By late afternoon, the chanting started again, soft at first, then building in intensity. Mark stood by the window, staring out at the swirling fog. "They're calling me?" he said in a monotone voice. "She's calling me." A prickle of fear ran down my spine. "Don't go out there," I pleaded. "Please." He turned to me, and his eyes looked hollow. "Stay out of my way," he said, and then he bolted out the door. My fear for him warred with my own sense of self-preservation. But I couldn't just leave him out there. Grabbing the second flashlight, I raced after him. The thick fog swallowed me within seconds. I could barely see my own hand in front of my face, but I could hear the chanting echoing all around, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I took a few steps, hoping I was going in the direction Mark had taken, when a figure loomed out of the mist. I caught a glimpse of a pale face, hair matted against it, and then a hand, slender and bone-white, pressed hard against my chest, knocking me off balance. I tripped, maybe over a root or a rock, and fell backward. When I looked up, a circle of robed figures emerged from the fog. Their voices blended into that same haunting chant. One of them reached down and pulled me to my feet, gripping my arm roughly. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat, choked by pure terror. They tied my wrists behind my back with a rough rope and shoved me forward, deeper into the forest. My heart was hammering in my chest. I strained to see through the fog, and my blood ran cold when I finally spotted him. It was Mark. He was standing with them, among the robed figures, his eyes unfocused. "Mark," I called out, my voice desperate, pleading. "Mark, it's me." He didn't even look at me. The robed figures, men and women, judging by their shapes, led us to a clearing. It was dark, lit only by flickering torches stuck into the muddy ground. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, with those same strange symbols etched into its surface, the ones from the trees, from the cabin door. And standing in front of the altar, in the shifting torchlight, I saw her. The woman Mark had described. Her hair hung in tangled strands, and her skin looked sickly pale. Her eyes were like dark pits. She raised her arms, and the chanting rose in a crescendo, a terrifying, unholy sound. It felt like the entire forest was pulsing with it. Two of the robed figures forced me to my knees by the altar, pinning me there. The woman approached. She placed a thin, cold hand under my chin and lifted my face. I felt my muscles lock, frozen in place. I couldn't tear my gaze away from hers. And then I heard a voice, whispering in my head, though her lips never moved. "You will be my offering." Time lost all meaning. The robed figures began swaying, chanting louder. I could feel the woman's presence, like a suffocating weight, pressing into my mind, filling me with dread. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mark again. He was still standing in the circle, his eyes blank, vacant. One of the robed figures handed him a jagged knife. My blood turned to ice. "Mark." "No," I whispered. "This isn't you." He took a shaky step forward, gripping the knife. For a second, just a split second, I thought I saw recognition flicker in his eyes. Then the woman placed a hand on his forehead, and he went rigid again. He advanced toward me. I felt around with my bound hands, desperately searching for anything I could use. My fingers brushed against a stone, small but pointed. With the last shred of willpower I had, I managed to grab it. If I could just cut the rope. The robed figures were chanting even louder now, their voices echoing off the trees. Mark raised the knife. I saw tears in his eyes, but I couldn't tell if they were his own or part of whatever nightmare had him in its grip. A surge of adrenaline kicked in. With a frantic tug, I sawed at the rope with the stone. The moment I felt the rope snap, I flung myself sideways. Mark's knife whistled through the air, missing me by inches, and clanged against the stone altar. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the sharp stone. Without thinking, I lunged at Mark, trying to knock him away from the altar, away from the circle. We collided, and he fell to the ground, the knife skittering away into the darkness. The robed figures hissed and rushed forward. I grabbed the knife before they could, and waved it wildly, forcing them back a step. My heart was pounding so loudly, I thought it would explode. The woman, the witch, I realized, raised her arms and shrieked, a sound that tore through the forest like a banshee's wail. In that chaos, I saw an opening. I shoved Mark away from the circle, and for a moment he seemed disoriented, confused. "Run," I screamed. But he didn't move fast enough. One of the robed figures tackled him. I had no choice. If I stayed, I'd be overwhelmed. With the knife still clutched in my shaking hand, I sprinted into the woods. Branches whipped at my face, and roots threatened to trip me at every turn, but I didn't dare stop. The chanting and shrieking echoed behind me, but the fog was clearing slightly, making it a little easier to see. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but I pushed myself harder, fueled by adrenaline and terror. I had no idea where I was going, only that I had to get away. Eventually, I stumbled upon the small creek near our cabin. I recognized the bend in the water. I stopped, panting, and looked back. The forest was eerily quiet now. My mind reeled. Had Mark escaped? Was he still with them? A fresh wave of guilt and horror washed over me. I felt like a coward for running, for leaving him behind. I wanted to go back, to try and save him, but how could I, one person, stand against a whole cult, against that which every survival instinct I had told me to keep going, to try and make it to the main road, to find help. But the thought of leaving Mark to whatever fate they had planned for him was unbearable. I forced myself to move, following the creek, hoping it would lead me somewhere, anywhere. The clouds parted briefly, and a sliver of moonlight illuminated the path. When I finally reached the cabin clearing, I saw that the front door was wide open. The inside was pitch black. Carefully I stepped inside, my heart in my throat. The place was in shambles. Furniture was overturned. The lantern was smashed on the floor, and a single candle flickered on the table. A shape lay slumped in the corner. As I got closer, I realized with a jolt that it was Mark. Mark. I dropped to my knees beside him. He was breathing, but shallowly. His arm was twisted at a horrible angle, clearly broken. Deep scratches marred his chest and neck. His eyes fluttered open. "Sarah," he croaked, his voice hoarse. I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. I'm here." He stared at me with a mixture of confusion and terror. "She's in my head," he mumbled. I can't stop hearing her." I gently tried to examine his arm, but I had no idea how to set a fracture. I was shaking with anger and fear, feeling utterly helpless. That's when I heard them. Footsteps outside, several pairs, crunching through the undergrowth. They had found us. I spotted a small hunting knife on the floor near the fireplace. Mark must have grabbed it before he ran out. I clutched it tightly in one hand, supporting Mark with the other. "We have to leave," I hissed. "We can't stay here." But Mark shook his head, tears sliding down his cheeks. "I can't run," he whispered. My arm, panic clawed at my chest. The footsteps were getting closer. "Then I'll distract them," I said, my voice trembling. "And you." Without warning, Mark grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. His eyes seemed to go blank again, that vacant look returning. "No," he said, in a voice that sounded half like his, half like someone else's. "You won't leave me behind." His grip tightened painfully. I winced. "Mark, you're hurting me." He didn't let go. In that terrifying instant, I realized he might be possessed, or at least partially controlled by that witch. I tried to free myself, but he yanked me closer. The knife was still in my hand. I saw fear and madness swirling in his expression. "I can't let you go," he whispered. "She said I have to finish it." My pulse thundered in my ears. "Mark, you have to fight this," I pleaded. "It's not real. She's doing this to you." A tremor passed through him, and for a second, he loosened his grip. I took the chance and yanked my arm free, stumbling backward. The robed figures were just outside now, their chanting starting up again. Mark stood, wincing as he tried to move his broken arm. He lunged at me, but I sidestepped. It was like he wasn't fully in control of his own body, but he was still dangerous. In desperation, I raised the knife. "Don't make me do this," I begged. tears streaming down my face. He staggered forward, his eyes glassy. Before he could say anything else, one of the robed figures burst through the doorway, brandishing a crude, curved blade. Instinct took over. I slashed with my knife, catching the figure's arm. They cried out and fell back, but another immediately took their place. Everything became a blur of chaos. I ducked and dodged as best I could, adrenaline pumping through my veins. Mark stood in the corner, his head in his hands, clearly fighting some internal battle. In a wild arc, I stabbed at one of the cultists, forcing them back. The doorway was now partially blocked by two others, and outside, I could see more torches flickering, more robed shapes gathering. I realized with a jolt that the cabin had a small back window. If we could just break it, Mark, I screamed. Help me! Something in my voice seemed to reach him. He tore his gaze from the floor, and for a moment, I saw him, the real Mark, looking back at me. He limped toward the back window, grabbed the nearest chair with his good arm, and smashed the glass. The cultists shrieked, pressing forward to stop us. I used every ounce of courage I had, brandishing the knife to keep them at bay. Go, I yelled, shoving Mark toward the opening. He crawled through, glass crunching under him, and I followed, ignoring the cuts to my hands and arms. We stumbled outside into the dark forest. I could hear the cultists pouring out of the front door, circling the cabin to catch us. With Mark leaning on me heavily, we half ran, half limped away, guided by the faint moonlight. Branches tore at our clothes and skin, but we couldn't stop. The chanting behind us rose in pitch. The witch was near. I could feel her presence, like an oppressive weight pressing down on my chest. Eventually, the forest thinned, and I saw a narrow dirt road ahead. Relief flooded through me when I recognized it, the main route leading into the deeper areas of Blackwood State Forest. We limped onto the road, breathless. Mark was delirious with pain, mumbling incoherently. I spotted headlights in the distance. Summoning the last of my strength, I waved my arms, yelling for help. The car, a beat-up pickup truck, screeched to a halt. A pair of hunters, by the looks of them, got out. Their eyes went wide when they saw our disheveled state. I'm not sure what I managed to babble, but I must have mentioned something about a witch or a cult, because one of them grabbed a hunting rifle and scanned the trees while the other helped Mark into the back seat. They rushed us to the nearest hospital. Mark was whisked away by doctors, and I was left shaking in a waiting room, tears staining my cheeks. When the sheriff came to take my statement, I tried to explain what had happened. He looked at me like I was crazy. Some hysterical woman with a wild story about chanting, robed figures, and a witch in the woods. They sent a patrol out to the cabin later. I heard they found it ransacked, but found no trace of any cult or any robed figures. The symbols on the trees were there, but no one could explain them. They chalked it up to local law and vandalism. Mark remained in the hospital for a while. His arm was set in a cast, and he had to receive treatment for shock. Physically, he started to heal, but mentally, he was a shell of the man I knew. Sometimes, he'd wake up screaming about a voice in his head, about a pale woman and chanting. Then, he'd forget entire chunks of what happened. I tried to piece my life back together, but the nights were plagued by nightmares. Sometimes, I wake up with the echo of that humming in my ears. I've never set foot in Blackwood State Forest again. I'm sure the sheriff closed the case, labeling it a weird mishap. But in my heart, I know that the witch is still out there, waiting. And that's the truth of what happened to me. Sarah Jenkins, in those cursed woods. I don't know what that woman, or that thing, really was, but I do know we barely escaped with our lives. Part of Mark is still lost in that forest, and part of me is too. If you ever find yourself drawn to a secluded cabin in Blackwood, Heed my warning, there's something ancient and hungry lurking among those trees. And if you hear the humming, run. My name is Jack Riley. I'm 36, and let me tell you, the last few months have been a freaking nightmare. It all started on my family's old property, out near Possum Trot Road in Monroe County, Indiana. I'm still trying to figure out what the hell was real and what was just in my head, but this is how I remember it. I rolled up to the farmhouse at sunset. The gravel driveway was choked with weeds, and the whole place looked way more beat down than I remembered from when I was a kid. See, I'd just gone through a messy divorce, and I guess I was desperate to grab onto something, anything, that felt like it belonged to me. I needed a fresh start, on my own terms. The house groaned like some old beast when I stepped inside. The floors were all warped from years of neglect, but hey, at least it was still standing. Even in the fading light, I could see the paint peeling off the walls like sunburnt skin, mold creeping along the ceiling like dark veins, and furniture buried under a mountain of dust. But you know what? Despite the musty air, I felt this weird wave of relief. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe I just needed to be anywhere but my old life. I had a couple of boxes of canned food, a leaky generator in the back of my truck, and my grandpa's old shotgun. It's enough, I told myself. The first night was surprisingly calm. The silence out there was absolute, like the world was holding its breath. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves outside. I set up a cot in the old living room. It was the biggest space and pretty much free of junk. Around midnight, I heard a single thump on the porch, like a small branch falling from one of the trees. I went to check it out, but there was nothing there except a bunch of dead leaves. The next morning, I took a better look around. The cornfield out back was a total mess, stalks all droopy and tangled. My phone was useless, no signal, which I kind of expected. This part of Monroe County was notorious for bad reception. Still, it made me feel uneasy. I shook it off, telling myself I needed to focus on practical stuff, patching the roof, fixing the windows, and getting that damn generator running so I could at least have a single light inside. I was sorting through a box of tools when I noticed footprints in the dirt near the porch steps. They were about my shoe size, but spaced out all weird, like whoever made them had been limping or something. I crouched down, trying to see if maybe they were mine from the night before, but they didn't match the pattern on my boots. A cold shiver went up my spine. Probably just some local teenagers messing around, I thought, or maybe an old imprint from years ago. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A few days later, my buddy, Ethan Reed, showed up. He was the only one who knew where I was, and honestly, I was damn glad to see him. We'd been tight since college. Ethan was always the adventurous type, quick with a joke, but also practical as hell, which was good, because I needed help replacing busted shingles and fixing those broken windows. He brought extra supplies from a hardware store in town, plus enough bottled water to last us a week. We spent the day getting the generator to cooperate, and by evening, we had a shaky source of power in the living room. I told Ethan about the weird footprints, and he just laughed it off. Probably just some bored-ass kids, he said. They get up to all kinds of weird crap out here. He flicked his flashlight around the perimeter of the house. If they come by again, we'll scare 'em off. That night, we grilled some burgers over a small fire pit and drank a few beers. It felt almost normal, like we were just on some casual camping trip. But then, around midnight, a scream ripped through the air from the far edge of the property. It was high, pitched, and cut off abruptly, like someone had been startled. Ethan grabbed his flashlight, and we both stood there, frozen, listening. but all we heard was silence. In the morning, Ethan said he had to head back into town for more supplies. He gave me this odd look as he climbed into his car. "You sure you're right out here, man?" he asked. I just shrugged. I was determined to make this farm my home again, no matter how creepy things felt. Ethan promised he'd be back the next day. I spent the rest of that afternoon patching a hole in the bedroom ceiling. As the sun started to set, I tried to ignore the feeling of being watched through the grimy windows. Every time I went outside, I'd catch glimpses of movement at the tree line, shadows that looked like someone darting behind a trunk. But whenever I went to check, the woods were empty. I felt like an idiot jumping at shadows. That night, sleep was impossible. A storm rolled in, hammering the roof with rain, and the thunder shook the windows like a giant's fist. Around 2:00 a.m., I heard voices outside. One of them sounded exactly like me. My own voice, calling my name, Jack. "Jack, come outside." My heart was pounding like a drum in my chest. The voice repeated itself, quieter this time, like it was right under the window. When I finally worked up the nerve to look, lightning flashed, and there was a figure standing at the edge of the field. The shape was backlit by the flash, so I couldn't see a face, but it was tall, and the way it stood, it was like looking at my own reflection in a warped mirror. Then the lightning faded, and the figure was gone. I barely slept the rest of the night. When morning came, I was so exhausted I couldn't even question my own sanity. I kept busy with chores, checking the generator's fuel, sweeping debris off the porch, anything to distract myself from the dread that was gnawing at my gut. Ethan rolled back in that afternoon. At first, everything seemed normal. He hopped out of his car, cracking a joke about how the nearest gas station had a power outage, so he had to drive another 10 miles to find one that was open. He helped me unload the supplies he'd bought, but as we sat down to eat, I noticed something was off. The way he was sipping his water, it was almost mechanical, and his eyes kept darting around, not meeting mine. He was quieter too, not tossing out his usual one-liners. After lunch, we split up to tackle different chores. Ethan went to the barn to organize some old lumber, and I started picking up broken glass in the living room. About an hour later, I heard raised voices outside. I rushed to the barn door and froze. There were two figures in there, and they both looked exactly like Ethan. They were shouting at each other in low, angry voices. One of them turned my way, and I saw his face clearly. It was Ethan, but twisted with rage or pain. When it saw me watching, it darted behind a stack of rotting hay bales. The other figure stayed put, staring right at me. "Jack," he said, in Ethan's voice. "Everything all right?" He was calm, like nothing weird was happening. I stammered, pointing to where I'd seen the other shape. "I just saw another you." He smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're tired. Man, I told you this place was messing with your head. Why don't you lie down?" He brushed past me, patting my shoulder in a way that felt disturbingly cold. Something about him smelled different too, like damp earth. I followed him back to the house in a daze, half convinced I was hallucinating. But that second Ethan hadn't been a trick of the light. I'd heard two distinct voices, one furious, the other calm and controlled. That evening, while Ethan was in the bathroom, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I went through his duffel bag. There, buried under a spare set of clothes, was a blood-stained hunting knife. The handle looked old, worn almost smooth, and beneath it, a bundle of twisted sticks tied together with twine, forming some kind of crude doll. It looked vaguely like a person, but with a wide, gaping mouth. A chill went through me. I zipped the bag shut just as Ethan came back in. He gave me this hard look, like he knew what I'd done, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he moved toward the kitchen. rummaging around like he was looking for something. I followed him slowly, every nerve on edge. He said, his voice disturbingly calm, "I think you're losing it out here. Maybe we should tie you down. For your own safety." My eyes went wide. "What are you talking about?" "You've been seeing things that aren't there, hearing voices." He took a step closer, backing me up against the counter. "I want to help you, but you're making it hard." Before I could react, he lunged, knocking the wind out of me. I struggled, but he was stronger than I'd ever known him to be. He twisted my arm behind my back until I screamed. I felt the cold plastic of a zip tie tighten around my wrists. The room started to spin as he dragged me out to the barn, cursing under his breath about preparations. He tied me to a beam with rough rope, my feet barely touching the ground. The storm from earlier had left puddles inside, and I felt the cold dampness seeping through my shoes. Rain dripped from the roof, each drop echoing in the silent barn. Above me, the rafters flickered in the light of a single bulb powered by the generator. Once he was gone, I had time to test the ropes. They were too tight, the beam slick with old mold. Panic surged through me. Where was the real Ethan? Was this thing that looked like him the same creature I'd glimpsed in the cornfield? Eventually, I drifted off into a fitful sleep, a haze of terror and exhaustion. I woke to the sound of voices outside the barn. One was definitely Ethan's. The other voice, it also sounded like Ethan's, but deeper, raspier, filled with a chilling rage. They were arguing, but I couldn't make out the words. Then, silence. The barn door creaked open. I braced myself, heart hammering. But instead of the doppelganger, I saw Ethan, my actual friend. Or so I hoped, rush in. His eyes were wild, darting around. He ran to me and quickly cut the rope. "Jack," he hissed. "They have to get out of here now." My throat felt raw. I wasn't even sure if I could speak without choking. He grabbed my arm, and we stumbled out into the open. The moon hung low, casting the farm in a pale, silvery light. The broken-down house looked even more eerie, its windows like vacant eyes. Around the corner, I spotted something on the ground, a body. As we got closer, I recognized the jacket. It was Ethan's jacket. My stomach lurched. "Is that?" I stammered, staring at the corpse's twisted neck and shredded throat. The face, half hidden in shadow, looked exactly like Ethan. Blood matted the dirt around it. The Ethan beside me trembled. "Jack." That stopped. He stopped, coughing violently. "I don't know what that is, but we can't stay." He tried to pull me toward his car, but I resisted, half in shock. "Which one are you?" I asked, my eyes flicking between the man next to me and the body on the ground. My voice cracked. "Who are you?" He didn't answer, just tugged harder on my arm. My head was spinning. I scrambled to grab the shotgun from the porch. I needed some kind of protection, no matter who or what was standing next to me. As we neared the front steps, the door to the farmhouse creaked open. Out stepped another figure. Me, same height, same build, even the same faded jeans I was wearing. Its face was partly in shadow, but I felt it in my bones, that was my face. It opened its mouth, whispering, "Jack, help me." In my own voice. The Ethan beside me let out a ragged shout and fired a pistol he'd pulled from his waistband. The figure jerked back, then vanished into the darkness. My ears rang from the shot. I noticed the bullet had shattered one of the windows. When I turned back to the yard, the body wearing Ethan's clothes was gone. There was only a smear of blood on the ground. I stumbled forward. Where did it go? Did it crawl away? Ethan grabbed my shoulder. "Doesn't matter. We have to leave now." We rushed to his car, fumbling for the keys. As soon as we got inside, Ethan froze, staring at something in the rearview mirror. "Lock the doors," he muttered, his voice quivering. I pressed the button, and the soft click echoed in the cramped interior. Outside, The night seemed to press in on us, every shadow a potential threat. He turned the key. The engine coughed, but it wouldn't start. Panic flared. He tried again, pumping the gas, but the car only sputtered, refusing to turn over. Damn it, he cursed. I filled up the tank yesterday. This shouldn't be happening. Fear propelled me. Let's just run, I said. We can cut through the woods, find help at the next farm. We got out, glancing around for any sign of those things. The wind carried a low, almost human moan from the direction of the barn. That was all the encouragement we needed. We sprinted toward the dense tree line, the moon our only guide. Branches whipped at our faces, and the undergrowth snagged at our ankles. My lungs burned as we pushed deeper into the woods. Then, abruptly, the trees opened into a small clearing. At its center stood a crude altar made of stones and rotted timber. A twisted effigy perched on top, just like the one I'd found in Ethan's bag, only larger, more detailed. It was shaped like a man, but with a hollow face, its mouth agape. The stench of decay made me gag. A rustle behind us made me whirl around. A group of shadowy figures circled the clearing, each one bearing a sickening resemblance to either Ethan or me, their faces partially obscured by the darkness. They moved in unison, their heads tilting at the same unnatural angle. I heard a hiss from one of them. It's time. Suddenly, hands grabbed me from behind, pulling me backward. Ethan lunged, trying to free me, but two figures seized him as well. They were strong, inhumanly so. They dragged us to the altar, my mind reeling with panic. I tasted copper, realizing I'd bitten my tongue in the struggle. One of them, wearing my face, hissed into my ear. "We feed on fear, we feed on you." Its breath smelled of damp soil, like the earth in a fresh grave. They tied me to the altar with thick rope, the same coarse texture as the one Ethan had used in the barn. I saw them tie Ethan down on the other side. My doppelganger hovered above me, its eyes glinting in the moonlight. I struggled, screaming, kicking, but it was no use. A hoarse whisper rose among them, some twisted chant that rattled my bones. This was more than just one creature. It was an ancient presence that thrived on isolation, on driving people insane. My mind flashed to old family tales about the farm, stories of sudden disappearances, quiet tragedies. Had my ancestors somehow bargained with this entity? The chanting grew louder, swirling with the wind. I felt the ropes around me loosen as the group parted, distracted by some invisible command. Maybe this was my chance. My heart thundered. With all my might, I twisted my wrists, ignoring the pain of the rope cutting into my skin. The knot slipped, slightly. I managed to jerk one arm free, then the other. I scrambled to untee my ankles. Ethan was watching me, his eyes pleading. I tried to reach for him, but the chanting figures suddenly noticed my escape. One lunged at me. I grabbed a jagged rock from the altar and smashed it into the creature's head. It stumbled back with an unnerving cry, a warped echo of my own voice. That moment of chaos was enough. I scrambled over to Ethan and helped him free one of his hands. Together, we kicked off the ropes. The figures rushed us, hissing and snarling. We bolted into the woods, adrenaline pouring through our veins. I didn't dare look back. My only goal was to run until I found civilization, until the sun rose, until anything made sense again. Branches tore at my arms and face, the cold night air biting at my lungs. A sharp pain erupted in my side when I tripped over a root, tumbling headlong onto the forest floor. Ethan hauled me up, but then he stiffened. His face went slack, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Before I could react, something yanked him backward into the darkness. I heard him scream, "Jack," and then silence. My entire body trembled. My best friend had been pulled into some fathomless abyss of the night. I wanted to go after him, but fear paralyzed me. I stumbled onward, alone, half blind with terror, until I saw the faint glow of the farmhouse porch light. I don't remember how long it took me to reach it. Inside, the house looked like a tornado had ripped through it. Furniture overturned, shattered glass everywhere. The generator still hummed faintly, powering a single lamp in the living room. I collapsed onto the couch, gasping for air. My mind raced with images of Ethan being dragged away, the body in the yard, the copy of me in the clearing. I managed to gather enough strength to stumble out to my truck. By some miracle, the engine turned over on the first try. I tore down Possum Trot Road, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. I drove until I found a main road, until I saw street lights and gas stations again. But that's not quite the end. 3 days later, after I'd given a delirious statement to the local authorities, they searched the property. All they found were my footprints and signs of a struggle, but no bodies, no evidence of a ritual site, and certainly no sign of Ethan. It was as if he'd never existed out there. The official report labeled him a missing person, foul play suspected but unconfirmed. The nightmares started soon after. I couldn't sleep without seeing that twisted altar, hearing that chanting. Even in the daylight, I was constantly looking over my shoulder. Friends tried to console me, but how do you explain any of this? The police eventually stopped calling with updates. No leads, no resolution. A week later, I caught my reflection in a storefront window. My own face stared back, but for a split second, I swear it smiled at me before I smiled. It was a tiny delay, so quick most people wouldn't notice, but it was there. I haven't been back to the farm since. I live in a small apartment now, surrounded by noise and people. I keep telling myself that I got away, that whatever was out there is gone, that I'm free. But sometimes, late at night, I catch a glimpse of a man outside my window who looks just like me. And every so often, when I look in the mirror, I see the corners of my lips move just a heartbeat too late, like a reflection with a mind of its own. I wish I could say I'm certain of who I am, but the truth is I'm not. That place took something from me. Maybe my sanity, maybe something deeper. All I know is, I'll never be the same again. And if you ever find yourself driving down Possum Trot Road in Monroe County, keep going. Don't stop. Because once that farm takes hold of you, it never truly lets you go.